At the heart of the world's largest known empire, a child observes how power operates. He holds no power himself, yet he is closer to it than anyone, close enough to witness every detail, every shadow, every language and ritual it employs to sustain itself. This child's name, written in ancient Persian as Xerxes, means ruling hero. His father, Darius I, was the most skilled administrator of the Achaemenid Empire, transforming the legacy of military conquests by Cyrus and Cambyses into a mature system of governance. His mother, Atossa, was the daughter of Cyrus the Great, a descendant of those who witnessed the founding myths of Persia. Two bloodlines converge in this child, one from the institutionalization of power, the other from its sanctification. He would later become Xerxes I, one of the Persian emperors who reached the peak of power in history and most profoundly encountered its limits. The story of this documentary begins with this child. Around 519 BC, Xerxes was born into an empire in its prime. His father, Darius, had spent nearly a year quelling rebellions across the empire, as recorded in the Behistun inscription, and then devoted 2 decades to forging it into the most sophisticated administrative machine of the ancient world. Royal roads, postal stations, standardized weights and measures, a silver coinage system, and a satrapy system. These institutions enabled a vast territory stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River Valley to operate under relatively effective central authority. Xerxes was born after this system had already taken shape. The empire he saw was not one in the process of being built, but one that seemed to exist as a matter of course. This sense of inevitability is one of the most common and dangerous illusions in the intergenerational transfer of power. It leads successors to believe that maintenance is sufficient, unaware of how arduous the original construction was. He would inherit an empire that seemed to require no reinvention, not knowing that every pillar of this empire had been tested and repaired time and again through countless crises before it could stand firm. Xerxes was not the eldest son of Darius. This fact remained an unresolved question throughout his upbringing. Before becoming emperor, Darius had married the daughter of Artanes and fathered his firstborn. Artabazanes, Xerxes, on the other hand, was the first son born to Darius after his ascension to the throne with Atossa. Two principles of succession clashed here: primogeniture, or the priority of the queen's son. The contours of this succession dispute are known to us through the accounts of the Greek historian Herodotus. Xerxes' claim to the throne was partly bolstered by the prestige of his maternal grandfather Cyrus. This controversy was not merely a power struggle within a family. It reflected the long-standing structural ambiguity in the succession system of the Achaemenid Empire. The absence of a single codified principle of succession meant that every transfer of power carried the potential for renewed contention. This ambiguity would resurface in the bloodiest manner after Xerxes' death, ultimately becoming one of the internal forces driving the empire's decline. Atossa is an indispensable figure in the story of Xerxes. As the daughter of Cyrus the Great, she was successively married to Cambyses II, her brother, in accordance with Persian royal marriage customs, the usurper Gaumata, and finally to Darius. Her political influence is almost entirely absent from Persian historical sources. Persian inscriptions are texts of male kingship, where women do not appear. Her outline comes from Herodotus's indirect descriptions. She is said to have played a crucial role in the struggle for Xerxes' succession. However, we must be clear that this narrative comes from a Greek perspective that understood Persian court politics as harem manipulation. How much political agency the real Atossa truly possessed and the logic behind her actions are things we can never fully reconstruct from the existing historical materials. Her importance lies in reminding us that behind imperial succession, there are always unseen forces at work. These forces do not appear in inscriptions, nor do they leave archives for historians to retrieve, yet they may have determined at critical moments which name would be carved in stone. The surface of history is a narrative of kingship, but beneath it lies much space that cannot be illuminated. Shortly after securing Xerxes' succession, Darius initiated a strategic move that would alter Xerxes' fate. He decided to complete the unfinished revenge of the Marathon campaign by launching an expedition against Greece. In 492 BC, he dispatched Mardonius to attack Greece by land. In 490 BC, he sent Datis and Artaphernes with a naval force to strike directly at Attica, where they suffered a historic defeat at Marathon. This defeat, while not substantial enough to shake the empire's overall strength, left an indelible mark on its narrative. In his youth, Xerxes witnessed how his father transformed this failure into a kind of accumulating energy, a historical unfinished business that needed to be completed, corrected, and overwritten with victory. The weight of this unfinished business would press upon his shoulders with redoubled force after his ascension. For a successor, the hardest thing to escape is often not the institutions or territories left by the predecessor, but the unfinished narrative, a narrative that demands to be continued and completed to prove that the succession itself is meaningful. In a sense, Xerxes' campaign against Greece was the long-term occupation of a son's will by his father's unfinished business. The succession of an empire is not merely the transfer of power, but also the inheritance of a complex ideological legacy. The emperors of the Achaemenid dynasty relied on two parallel languages of legitimacy in their external proclamations. One was Persian, Iranian, with Zoroastrian Ahura Mazda as the source of divine authority. The other was the local language of conquered regions, modeled on the Cyrus Declaration, promising respect for local deities and traditions. Darius wielded these two languages with great skill, appearing as the devout servant of Ahura Mazda in the inscriptions of Persepolis, and as the legitimate ruler chosen by Marduk in Babylonian records. What Xerxes inherited was not only land and armies, but also this meticulously maintained system of legitimacy, and his later inclination to break it in a more personal manner. The parallel maintenance of these two languages of legitimacy required a high degree of political flexibility and an inherent respect for other cultures. Yet Xerxes' temperament seemed more inclined toward a singular and clear expression of authority rather than a complex, pluralistic balance. This inclination stands as one of the deepest character imprints of his reign. The youth education of Xerxes is almost a complete blank in the existing historical records. We do not know what he specifically studied, who his teachers were, or what worldview he developed during his long years as the crown prince. What we have are only retrospective projections of his later actions. A man with a strong pursuit of order and unity, one who lacked tolerance for any form of disobedience, and who believed that the boundaries of the empire were the boundaries of civilization, beyond which lay chaos and barbarism. However, we must remain cautious of such retrospection. Using outcomes to infer causes is one of the most common pitfalls in historical narratives. How his worldview was formed remains beyond our direct knowledge. We can only cautiously infer a certain consistency behind his actions through his deeds. This method of deducing causes from results is a common approach in historical research, but it always carries an inherent risk. We may unconsciously organize the open-ended moments of the past based on the known outcomes, thereby narrating contingency as inevitability and portraying a real person as a character predetermined by their fate. In 486 BC, Darius passed away at approximately 64 years of age while preparing for another expedition against Greece. Xerxes succeeded him, estimated to be around 33 at the time. At the moment of his accession, he stood at a unique historical juncture. The empire had never been so vast. Its administrative system, never so refined. Yet Egypt was in rebellion. Babylon was unstable. The unfinished business with Greece awaited, and the Scythian threat on the eastern frontier remained unresolved. The full weight of power descended all at once upon the shoulders of a man who had yet to be tested by its true burden. Such moments are recurring points of tension in the biographies of historical monarchs. Heirs who grow up under their father's protection, observing power closely, but never having to exercise it independently. The gap between theory and practice suddenly becomes real at the moment of coronation. The deepest lessons of power never come from observation alone, but from bearing its full weight, including the necessity of making irreversible decisions with incomplete information, the reality that any mistake is magnified on an imperial scale, and the solitude of having no one to truly share the burden of final judgment. Xerxes' first public act upon ascending the throne was to swiftly quell the rebellion in Egypt. This suppression, completed between 486 and 485 BCE, was noted for its efficiency and deterrence. But his handling of Egypt was markedly more severe compared to Darius' usual lenient approach toward the region. This early signal is noteworthy. Darius was accustomed to using the language of the conquered to assert his legitimacy after conquest. Xerxes' approach in Egypt leaned more toward emphasizing the central authority of the empire, rather than respecting local traditions. This difference in style was not accidental. It reflected a distinct imperial philosophy. Unity could arise from respecting diversity or from enforcing uniformity. Xerxes chose the latter, or rather, his personality and judgment led him toward it. The cost of this choice would manifest in various forms throughout his reign. Enforced uniformity could create superficial compliance. Yet, it would accumulate latent resistance in the hearts of the coerced. And this resistance would not appear as open defiance. It would seep into every crevice of the empire's operations through neglect, delay, and betrayal. When necessary, becoming the silent, yet ever-widening crack within the imperial system. What did it mean to be the King of Kings in that era? This title, ex Phaia, Phaia, ex Phaia, Phaean, Phaewem. What is the standard designation for Achaemenid emperors, literally meaning King of Kings? It was not merely an honorary self-designation. It reflected the actual political structure of the Persian Empire. Within the empire, there were countless vassal kings, local rulers, and tribal chiefs, with the emperor as the supreme ruler over all. The highest authority that kept the entire hierarchical system functioning. This system required the emperor to demonstrate his authority in different ways at different times. Sometimes as a guardian of religion, sometimes as a military leader, sometimes as an administrative arbiter, and sometimes as a symbolic representative of civilizational order. Xerxes was the inheritor of this multifaceted role. What he achieved, where he succeeded in unexpected ways, and where he failed in equally unexpected ways, are the ongoing inquiries throughout this documentary. But before examining these, it is most important to remember, he was a real person who once existed, not merely a placeholder for the preconceived role of the arrogant Eastern tyrant in Greek moral narratives. The imperial court is the most concentrated locus of power and also the most perilous place. Before becoming emperor, Xerxes spent his entire life within this court. He witnessed all the games of court politics, who was trusted, who was alienated, whose advice was heeded, and who lost everything overnight. He saw how the emperor was both surrounded and isolated by information, because everyone who conveyed information to the emperor filtered and packaged it to some degree in the process. This loneliness amidst encirclement is the common plight of all holders of absolute power, and Xerxes' upbringing in the court allowed him to fully observe every facet of this predicament, though it did not necessarily teach him how to escape it. Observing power and truly wielding it are two entirely different experiences. The former provides knowledge, while the latter demands endurance, enduring the consequences of decisions that, once made, cannot be undone. Enduring the reality that everyone who approaches you harbors some purpose. Enduring the situation where your every joy and sorrow sends ripples throughout the entire system. This kind of endurance cannot be learned in advance through observation. It can only be acquired through experience. Persepolis was the material heart of Xerxes' world. Darius began its construction, and Xerxes expanded it on a grand scale. It was not the administrative capital of the Persian Empire. That was Susa, where daily governance took place, but rather the ceremonial center of the empire, the sacred site, where delegations from across the lands came to offer tribute during the annual Nowruz Persian New Year, and the stage where kingship proclaimed itself to the entire empire in the most magnificent architectural language. Xerxes left his most significant architectural imprints here: the Gate of all nations and the Hall of 100 columns, which will be detailed in Chapter 6. What must be remembered here is the special relationship he had with this city. He was born here, grew up here, inherited power here, and left here his most direct material expression of his relationship with the empire. Architecture was the most enduring statement he could leave for posterity, and what he chose to leave behind, and in what manner, is one of the most reliable gateways to understanding his self-perception, closer to his own inner language than any narrative relayed through others. Xerxes' faith is an indispensable dimension for understanding him. He was a devout follower of Ahura Mazda, a fact clearly and repeatedly expressed in the inscriptions he left behind. The Zoroastrian worldview interprets history as an eternal struggle between good truth fey order, Asha, and evil, lies fey chaos. Druja, with the emperor serving as Ahura Mazda's earthly agent, tasked with maintaining and expanding the order of Asha within his realm. This framework of belief endowed Xerxes with a psychological structure we have also seen in Constantine. His power was not merely secular, but part of the cosmic order. Resistance to his authority was not just political rebellion, but a cosmic alignment with lies and chaos. This conviction served as the driving force behind his actions, and the religious root of his intolerance for dissent. In a worldview that interprets political resistance as taking the wrong side on a cosmic scale, tolerating dissent requires not only political wisdom, but also a reflective distance from this very belief system. A distance that is exceedingly difficult to cultivate in someone who has never questioned the legitimacy of their own power. At the moment Xerxes ascended to the throne, the empire's geographical expanse was staggering, stretching from the Aegean Sea in the west to the Indus River in the east, from the Black Sea in the north to the borders of Nubia in the south. This territory encompassed dozens of languages, hundreds of local traditions, and countless religious beliefs and forms of social organization. Managing this diversity was the central challenge of Achaemenid administrative wisdom and its most fundamental internal tension. The larger the empire, the higher the cost of maintaining unity, and any attempt to simplify governance through enforced uniformity would simultaneously fuel centrifugal forces. Xerxes faced the full weight of this tension, and his character and judgment would respond to it in a specific way at every critical juncture of his reign. That response was sometimes effective, sometimes came at an immense cost, and at times produced long-term consequences he himself could not foresee. Understanding how he responded to this tension is the key entry point to grasping the internal logic of the Achaemenid Empire's transition from its zenith to decline. This chapter traces his journey from birth and succession to the moment he ascended the throne. However, before delving into the history of his reign, there is a methodological reminder that this documentary must maintain throughout its narrative. The sources we have on Xerxes, in terms of quantity, quality, and perspective, exhibit a striking asymmetry with his actual historical impact. Persian sources, primarily inscriptions, administrative documents, and archaeological remains, present Xerxes as an imperial administrator and devout believer. Greek sources, dominated by Herodotus, portray him as an Oriental tyrant who failed due to arrogance and oppression. Both versions of Xerxes are products of genuine historical evidence and specific narrative frameworks. This documentary seeks to maintain the tension between these two perspectives, rather than simply choosing one. This is not an ambiguous evasion of stance, but a commitment to the fundamental honesty of historical research. When evidence points in different directions, forcing a unified narrative may be convenient for storytelling, but constitutes a failure of understanding. Embracing that uncertainty is the most basic respect we can offer the audience. Finally, let us return to the child who witnessed power. Born at the heart of the world's greatest empire, raised amidst grand architecture and ceremonies, he saw every facet of power, yet may not have truly grasped its deepest essence. He was about to inherit a balance his father had maintained throughout his life, and he would respond to all that this balance demanded in his own way. Sometimes more resolute, sometimes more grandiose, and sometimes more fragile. His story is one of inheritance and boundaries. How much was inherited, where the boundaries lay? And what happens to an individual and an empire when those boundaries are confronted? This is the story of Xerxes, an extreme case study of the nature of power, which will unfold over the following 9 chapters. In those chapters, we will see how his ambitions bridged the Hellespont, solidified into a silent shock on the shores of Salamis, and continue to speak in another language on the stones of Persepolis, until a courtly blade ended the story's continuation in time. Every new emperor's first test is often not of his own choosing. When Xerxes ascended the throne, Egypt was already in rebellion. This rebellion was a response to the gradual relaxation of Darius's rule in his later years. And yet another instance of resistance from Egypt, a land with 3,000 years of independent civilization. Against Persian imperial rule, Xerxes did not hesitate. Between 486 and 485 BCE, he swiftly organized a military suppression, accomplishing with efficiency and force the task his father had been unable to address before his death. Yet the significance of this suppression lies not only in what it achieved, but also in how it was carried out. How a new emperor handles his first crisis often becomes the clearest early expression of his entire ruling style. Xerxes' handling of Egypt was such an expression. It reveals a fundamental and not easily overlooked difference between this emperor's vision of empire and that of his father. Darius's method of ruling Egypt was a continuation of Cyrus's tradition. He accepted Egyptian deities, appeared as a pharaoh in temple inscriptions, adhered to Egyptian religious rituals, and allowed local elites to participate in regional administration. This multiple identities governance strategy presented the conqueror, in the eyes of the conquered, as a ruler willing to accept a local legitimacy framework, rather than an invader imposing a foreign order. The cost of this approach was that the emperor needed to continuously transform himself across different cultural contexts and maintain a high degree of cultural flexibility. Darius was willing and able to pay this price. Whether Xerxes was willing and possessed such inherent cultural flexibility was the real challenge for his Egyptian policy. The answer gradually became clear through his actions. He offered a simpler and more brutal solution than his father. Darius's flexibility required an intrinsic respect for the other, not out of morality, but out of pragmatic wisdom for imperial management. Whether Xerxes possessed this respect was one of the most important character tests of his early reign, and the outcome in Egypt provided a preliminary indicative answer. The details of Xerxes' handling of Egypt are limited in historical records. But the direction is clear. He revoked certain special privileges that Darius had granted to Egypt, strengthened Persia's direct administrative control over the region, and appointed his brother Achaemenes as the satrap of Egypt. This move served both to appoint a trusted military strongman to stabilize the situation and to assert the unshakable authority of the imperial center through the presence of a direct royal family member. This arrangement stood in stark contrast to Darius's strategy of cultivating local Egyptian elites as collaborators. Its efficiency is understandable. A newly enthroned emperor who needed to establish authority simultaneously across the empire could not afford the patience for long-term cultural integration after each rebellion. However, the price of short-term efficiency is often paid in long-term stability. In the decades that followed, Egypt would respond to this choice of short-term efficiency with more than one rebellion. No sooner had the rebellion in Egypt been quelled than Babylon presented Xerxes with an even greater challenge. In fact, Babylon did not rebel just once, but experienced two significant uprisings in quick succession during the early years of his reign. The first occurred around 484 BCE, led by a man named Bel-Shimani. The second took place in 482 BCE, under the leadership of Shamash-Ariba. Both were suppressed, and both leaders were executed. The recurrence of rebellion itself serves as a historical signal when a province twice rejects imperial authority by force within a short span. It indicates that the initial suppression did not fundamentally resolve the underlying tensions that sparked the revolt. It merely suppressed them temporarily. Violence can end a rebellion, but it cannot extinguish a suppressed will to resist, a will that waits for the next opportune moment to re-emerge. However, Xerxes' response to the second rebellion went beyond military suppression, entering a realm both exceptionally rare and perilous in the politics of ancient empires. He allegedly destroyed the statue of Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, and accordingly abandoned the traditional title of King of Babylon. To grasp the weight of this matter, one must first understand Marduk's position in the Babylonian world. Marduk was not merely the patron deity of Babylon. He was the very core of the Babylonian cosmological view. The divine force that created the world triumphed over primordial chaos and served as the fundamental source legitimizing Babylonian kingship. A legitimate king of Babylon in religious terms had to be chosen by Marduk and was required to grasp the hand of Marduk during the New Year ritual to renew this divine mandate. After Cyrus conquered Babylon, he integrated himself into the framework of Babylonian religious legitimacy, precisely by embracing this ritual. Darius likewise continued this practice. If Xerxes indeed destroyed the statue of Marduk, what he shattered was not merely an idol, but the most crucial link connecting imperial rule to the traditions of Babylonian civilization. This bond, woven with Cyrus's political wisdom and maintained through Darius's administrative patience, represented, in the eyes of the Babylonians, not just the arrogance of a foreign conqueror, but a fundamental denial of their entire civilizational identity. There exists an inherent consistency between Xerxes' actions in Babylon and his religious framework, which merits attention. For a devout follower of Ahura Mazda, the psychological stance toward deities regarded as supreme in a polytheistic civilization is complex. Should one tolerate the existence of pagan gods as a pragmatic concession for the empire? Or should one extend the Zoroastrian cosmic order, Asha, to Babylon, categorizing the worship of Marduk as part of falsehood fake chaos Druge? Darius chose the former. Xerxes, at least in the emotional historical moment following Babylon's second rebellion, likely opted for a version of the latter faith. In moments of power's fury, often manifests in a purer and more dangerous manner than in everyday life, when an emperor is both the ruler of an empire and the guardian of the cosmic order. His response to challenges is not merely a political act, but simultaneously a religious one. striking against chaos holds dual legitimacy in his worldview. This dual legitimacy serves as both a source of strength and a breeding ground for misjudgment. The political consequences of abandoning the title King of Babylon were profound. The legitimacy of Achaemenid imperial rule relied on different local languages across various regions of the empire. King of Babylon was not merely a title, it served as the anchor for the entire Babylonian legal system, land tenure, and administrative documentation. Documents signed under this title held specific authority within Babylonian judicial and administrative traditions. Abandoning this title meant redefining Babylon as a province of the Persian Empire, rather than a traditional kingdom retaining a degree of cultural distinctiveness within the imperial framework. While this redefinition might have effectively signaled a reinforcement of central imperial authority in the short term, it simultaneously severed a decades-old mechanism of local legitimacy. The resulting institutional vacuum would continue to generate centrifugal effects in the years to come. The stability of a governance system often stems not from coercive power, but from the governed's acceptance of its legitimacy. When that framework is removed, a system maintained solely by coercion incurs ever-increasing operational costs over time, eventually surpassing what the empire can sustainably bear. While dealing with Egypt and Babylon, Xerxes also faced a broader challenge of imperial governance: how to maintain effective central control within the satrap system established by his father. The satrap system designed by Darius was one of the most sophisticated frameworks for local governance in the ancient world. Satraps represented the central authority in managing the provinces, but checks and balances were necessary to prevent their power from expanding and becoming independent. This system functioned well under Darius, partly because he maintained a high level of personal attention to all parts of the empire. Xerxes inherited this system, but his own personality, more inclined toward assertive displays of authority than patient balancing, created notable points of friction in his interaction with a system that required continuous and delicate operation. A sophisticated system demands an operator who patiently seeks balance in the details, while an emperor inclined to express authority through grand gestures often simplifies complexity when faced with a system requiring careful fine-tuning. Each simplification leaves a small imbalance in some corner of the system. This segment of history provides us with a concrete case for contemplating the issue of style in imperial rule. Historians sometimes regard ruling style as secondary, believing that structural forces are the fundamental determinants of historical direction. However, Xerxes' early approach to handling Egypt and Babylon tells us that style can indeed be genuinely significant. The same problem, addressed in different ways, can yield vastly different long-term consequences. The cultural flexibility chosen by Darius when facing similar challenges created a centripetal force within the empire. The forced uniformity chosen by Xerxes, while perhaps equally effective in suppressing rebellions in the short term, accumulated a qualitatively different centripetal force within the empire, one built on fear rather than identification. The effectiveness of fear always has a shorter lifespan than that of identification. An order founded on fear begins to disintegrate at a much faster rate than one based on identification once external pressures disappear. The identification Darius gained through cultural investment, even if incomplete, proves more resilient over time at the margins than the compliance Xerxes secured through fear. Historical source note: the primary challenge in studying this period lies in our heavy reliance on Greek texts and Babylonian administrative documents, both of which carry inherent narrative biases. Greek sources tend to portray Xerxes' actions in Babylon as sacrilegious atrocities, serving their moral narrative of the hubris of tyrants, inevitably inviting divine retribution. Babylonian administrative records, meanwhile, can be interpreted in divergent ways. Some see evidence of continuity in governance, while others perceive rupture. Given this state of the sources, this documentary adheres to the principle of presenting what is known, noting points of contention, and refusing to fill genuine uncertainty with false certainty. Xerxes' actions in Babylon, regardless of their precise details, left an indelible and contentious mark on his historical legacy. A mark that is itself part of the historical record. Historical controversies can sometimes reveal the true weight of an event more than historical certainties. When a matter continues to provoke debate among historians 2.5 millennia later, its impact on the people of that time must have been profound. During the years of suppressing Egypt and Babylon, Xerxes simultaneously embarked on his largest strategic plan, the expedition against Greece. His father's defeat at Marathon was a historical debt that needed to be corrected. However, if Darius's Greek expedition was an unfinished ambition in the emperor's later years, Xerxes' commitment to the Greek campaign represented a more comprehensive mobilization. He gathered military resources from various provinces of the empire, initiated the construction of the Hellespont pontoon bridge and the Mount Athos Canal, and began over 3 years of systematic preparation. This preparatory work will be detailed in the next chapter. What needs to be pointed out here is that there existed a significant competition for time and resources between these preparations and the suppression of Egypt and Babylon before stability was fully achieved in the eastern and southern parts of the empire. Xerxes shifted his primary strategic focus to the west. This shift in strategic focus was the most important strategic decision of his entire reign, and the one whose internal logic most requires understanding. Why Greece? This question is more complex than it appears on the surface. The simplest answer lies in the will of his father. Darius's defeat at Marathon needed to be avenged, and the empire's prestige had to be restored. Yet, this answer falls far short of explaining the scale of resources Xerxes was willing to commit to this war. Deeper motivations may include the following layers. First, the support provided by Greek city-states to the rebels during the Ionian Revolt 499–493 BCE constituted a challenge that demanded a response within the empire as political logic. Second, pushing the empire's western frontier into Greece represented a grand narrative of completing the unification of the entire Eurasian continent in geopolitical terms. Third, a large-scale victorious war offered the fastest path for a new emperor, who had established his authority through suppression rather than construction. To secure his place in history, motives in history are never singular. Explaining Xerxes' expedition to Greece as avenging his father is both true and insufficient. Just as reducing any major historical decision to a single motive obscures the true complexity of historical action, a complexity that will continue to unfold in the chapters to come. Herodotus records a court debate on whether to launch an expedition against Greece, in which Xerxes' uncle Artabanus voiced opposition by highlighting the risks of the campaign, while Mardonius represented the pro-war faction. The authenticity of this debate, like many of Herodotus' accounts, must be approached with historical critical scrutiny. It may reflect real court discussions to some extent, or it could be a literary construct used by Herodotus to convey the moral theme of the arrogant Xerxes rejecting wise counsel. Regardless, the structural tension it describes, an emperor surrounded by differing voices in court, ultimately making decisions according to his own will, is a fundamental feature of real imperial politics. Herodotus' portrayal of this is one of the most vivid scenes of political debate in ancient literature, revealing a universal truth about power. Those who hold absolute power are always caught in an information dilemma. Those around them have strong incentives to tell them what they want to hear. While genuine risk assessment can only be verified by later events. From his ascension in 486 BC to the completion of large-scale expedition preparations in 481 BC, these 5 years marked Xerxes' most intensive period of empire building. He quelled Egypt, suppressed Babylon, consolidated the internal authority structure of the empire, and simultaneously set in motion the most massive war preparation machinery of the ancient world. During these 5 years, he demonstrated to all that he was a ruler capable of controlling the situation, at least in the traditional sense of military suppression. However, these years also sowed several seeds: Egypt's centrifugal tendencies, Babylon's cultural trauma, and the all or nothing military gamble on Greece. These seeds would grow in their own ways in the future, eventually converging into the more complex picture of his later reign. Every decision made in the present left its mark on the future, and the scale of an emperor's decisions was measured by the size of the empire. The decisions of these 5 years planted seeds, but at the moment they were sown, no one could fully foresee their trajectory. The causality of history often becomes clear only in hindsight, while for those in the midst of it, every decision was merely a judgment based on the most visible information of the moment. This chapter reveals another facet of Xerxes, a pragmatic crisis manager capable of swiftly mobilizing military forces, making clear authoritative declarations, and stabilizing the situation in the short term. These abilities are genuine and deserve serious consideration. Historical narratives sometimes portray an entire reign as incompetent or arrogant due to certain failures, an unjust oversimplification. Xerxes' approach to handling Egypt and Babylon was internally consistent within his own logical framework: swift, firm, and clear. The cost of this style lies not in it being wrong, but in its impact on the empire's long-term stability, a slow-burning erosion that takes longer to manifest. The price of history is often not paid at the moment of action, but deferred, emerging at a distant point in time far removed from its cause. This deferral is one of the greatest challenges in learning from history. When the cost finally comes due, it is separated from its cause by enough distance that those involved struggle to clearly see the chain of causality, and without seeing causality, one cannot truly learn from the price paid. Chapter 2 begins with the internal problems of an empire, and ends with its external ambitions, from the Egyptian rebellion to the Babylonian uprising, and the strategic planning of the Greek expedition. These 5 years outline how an emperor sought the path he believed to be right between his inherited legacy and his own will. Did he find it? In the next chapter, he will push the entire military might of the empire toward the Hellespont, using one of the grandest war preparations in human history to answer this question. That answer will not belong to him alone, but to all those waiting, watching, and enduring on both sides of that strait. Great wars in history are always waged in the name of rulers, but written with the bodies of countless nameless individuals. Xerxes' grand ambitions will transform into an expedition of hundreds of thousands, and the stories of those hundreds of thousands will, for the most part, never enter any historical record. Chapter 3 will take us to that strait, to that preparation, and to the extreme challenge of human will against the boundaries of nature and history behind that preparation. The ancient world had never witnessed war preparations on such a scale. Beginning around 484 BCE, Xerxes directed the entire resources of his empire toward a single direction, the west, Greece. This preparation lasted nearly 3 years, involving the mobilization of supplies from Egypt to India, the construction of infrastructure from Thrace to Asia Minor, and the systematic conscription of the military potential of every province in the empire. It was an administrative marvel and an immense drain on human resources. Herodotus recorded the scale of this mobilization with dazzling detail, and modern historians, when examining those numbers, can neither ignore the grandeur of his descriptions nor fully accept their precision. This preparation was one of the critical moments for understanding Xerxes as a person. It showcased his willpower, his organizational skills, and a ruler's mindset that completely intertwined his grand personal narrative with the empire's resources. Regardless of the final outcome, the preparation alone stands as a profoundly awe-inspiring historical event. The first major project in preparation was the Athos Canal. The Athos Peninsula is a narrow isthmus extending from the Thracian coast into the Aegean Sea, with a towering and perilous Mount Athos at its tip, known for frequent storms. It was precisely while rounding Mount Athos that Mardonius, a commander of Darius, encountered a catastrophic storm during the first Greek expedition in 492 BCE, resulting in the near total destruction of the fleet. Xerxes resolved not to take the same risk. He ordered the excavation of a canal at the narrowest point of the Athos Isthmus, allowing the fleet to cross without having to navigate the dangerous cape. This project spanned several years, employing an estimated tens of thousands of laborers conscripted from across Thrace, working in shifts. It was completed, becoming one of the few large-scale artificial waterways of the ancient world. It also served as the first tangible symbol of Xerxes' expedition, an emperor willing to reshape geography to serve his strategic ambitions. In ancient times, altering geography meant altering divine arrangements. The isthmus, in Greek understanding, was a boundary set by the gods. By cutting through it, Xerxes was not merely undertaking an engineering feat, but making a declaration. In his worldview, nothing was beyond the reach of imperial will. Thus, the Athos Canal became one of the earliest material expressions of the expedition's ethos. The second major engineering project in preparation, and the most famous engineering achievement of the entire expedition, was the Hellespont pontoon bridges, the Hellespont Strait, modern-day Dardanelles, separating Asia from Europe and approximately 1.3 kilometers wide, was the essential crossing point for Xerxes' army to move from Asia into Europe. His engineers connected warships side by side, laid wooden planks across them, and constructed two parallel pontoon bridges over the strait, allowing the army to cross on foot. This was a genuine feat of ancient engineering, requiring precise calculations of currents, tides, and vessel tension, as well as the coordinated positioning of hundreds of warships. According to Herodotus, the first attempt at building the bridges was destroyed by a storm, which enraged Xerxes. The two parallel bridges were designed for separate purposes, one for infantry and cavalry, and the other for supplies and livestock. This division of traffic indicates that the project was carefully planned rather than relying solely on brute force. The entire undertaking involved the precise positioning of hundreds of warships and a deep understanding of the tidal patterns of the Hellespont. Regardless of how much moral allegory is embedded in Herodotus' account of Xerxes' anger, the fact remains that the bridges were ultimately completed and bore the weight of the army's crossing. Historical note: Herodotus records that Xerxes, upon the destruction of the bridges, ordered the sea to be whipped 300 times, had shackles thrown into the water, and executed the original engineers. This detail carries a distinct moral allegorical tone. A ruler punishing nature to assert authority is a classic literary symbol of hubris in ancient texts. The film presents this detail in the tone of as recorded by Herodotus, without narrating it as established historical fact. It may reflect some genuine imperial anger, or it could be a later literary symbol of Xerxes' arrogance, or perhaps a combination of both. The second pontoon bridge was completed and subsequently withstood the weight of the army's passage. From an engineering perspective, this was a genuine technical achievement worthy of serious consideration, rather than being overshadowed by moral narratives of Xerxes' arrogance. Ancient engineers, without the aid of modern material science, constructed a floating passageway using wood, ropes, and warship hulls that could carry tens of thousands of people and their supplies, remaining intact for several days. This required precise observation of hydrological conditions, empirical understanding of material properties, and the organizational capacity for large-scale coordination. In this sense, Xerxes' engineers were historically underestimated technical achievers. Their accomplishments were overshadowed for centuries by the failures of the emperor they served. Historical memory is unfair. Successful engineering feats, after military defeat, are relegated to the background of a narrative of failure, while the defeat itself is amplified by moral narratives, overwhelming the technical achievements that deserve to be remembered independently. The engineers who stood by the Hellespont, regardless of their names, deserve recognition for their professional accomplishments on their own merit. Herodotus records a detail that this documentary wishes to pause on. It took the army 7 days to cross the pontoon bridge, and Xerxes, reportedly watching from a high vantage point, shed tears. When asked by those around him why he wept, he replied that he felt sorrow upon realizing that not a single one of these people would be alive 100 years later. Regardless of its historical accuracy, this detail presents a Xerxes starkly different from the image of an arrogant tyrant, a man struck by the brevity of human existence at the pinnacle of power, someone capable of perceiving insignificance within a grand spectacle. Perhaps it is true. Perhaps it is a humanizing narrative crafted by Herodotus. But this moment is one of the closest glimpses we get into this man's inner world throughout the entire documentary. A person who can perceive the transience and smallness of human fate within the grand spectacle he himself created is no simple tyrant. His awareness of life's impermanence, set against his pursuit of limitless power, creates an internal tension. A tension that may well be the deepest contradiction of his entire life. And that moment of tears is the clearest historical trace left by that contradiction. This preparation was also a diplomatic maneuver. Xerxes dispatched envoys to the Greek city, states demanding earth and water, the traditional symbols of submission to the Persian Empire. Many city-states responded with compliance, particularly those in the north. Sparta and Athens were the most notable refusers. It is said that the Spartans threw the envoys into a well, while the Athenians subjected the messengers to some form of violent treatment. These stories are highly politicized in Greek historical narratives. They serve to construct a narrative about the Greek spirit of freedom. Yet they also illustrate a genuine geopolitical reality. The responses among the Greek city-states were far from unified. Most chose not to confront the empire head-on, while a minority opted for resistance. That minority would determine the course of the war in the ensuing history. But before the spring of 480 BC arrived, this outcome remained uncertain. Coordination among the Greek city-states progressed with great difficulty amid deep-seated suspicion and conflicting interests. Sparta demanded command of the land forces. Athens insisted on command of the navy. And many city-states made their final choices only at the last moment. This fragmentation, while a weakness of the Greek city-state system, would also become a source of unique resilience once the conflict unfolded. During this period of preparation, Athens undertook a crucial action that would profoundly shape the course of history. It built a fleet in 483 BCE upon discovering new veins in the Laurium silver mines. The statesman Themistocles persuaded the Athenian assembly to use this unexpected wealth to construct 200 triremes. This decision, made around the same time Xerxes began his large-scale preparations, laid the material foundation for the subsequent Battle of Salamis in a mirrored fashion. History sometimes operates in this way: two opposing forces, over the same period, each accumulate energies whose full consequences they cannot foresee until a specific moment when these energies collide in a manner beyond either side's complete control. Themistocles' decision to build the fleet was a key prerequisite for understanding why Salamis could occur without Xerxes' simultaneous heavy reliance on naval power. the significance of that fleet would have been greatly diminished. Critical collisions in history are rarely the product of one-sided preparation, but rather the result of resonance formed by the respective preparations of both sides in a specific time and space. The encounter in the Strait of Salamis 2 years later was the ultimate manifestation of this bilateral accumulation. The mobilization from 484 to 481 BC brought together soldiers from across the empire, forming the most diverse combined army of the ancient world with an almost encyclopedic enthusiasm. Herodotus recorded the ethnic composition of this force: Persians, Medes, Scythians, Indians, Arabs, Ethiopians, Libyans. Nearly every people covered by the empire's territory was represented in Xerxes' army. In a sense, the army itself was a microcosm of the empire. Its diversity reflected the very essence of the Achaemenid Empire as a multi-ethnic political entity. Yet, this diversity was a double-edged sword in military terms. It brought overwhelming numerical superiority, but also profound challenges in coordination. The size of this army, as given by Herodotus, is astonishingly exaggerated, and modern scholars' estimates vary widely. Regardless of the exact numbers, it was undoubtedly one of the largest military mobilizations in human history at that time. Historical note: Herodotus recorded the total Persian force as numbering in the millions, which is logistically almost impossible. Modern historians typically estimate between 100,000 and 300,000, with some scholars suggesting even lower figures. The exaggeration of numbers served both the narrative needs of the Greeks, who mythologized the war, and likely reflected the psychological impact of a mobilization whose real scale already far exceeded ordinary wartime experience. This army, composed of dozens of ethnic groups, faced profound challenges in command, language barriers, differing tactical habits, and varying frameworks for understanding warfare. The coordination between Persian cavalry and Indian infantry required a sophisticated hierarchy of command and a translation system. The administrative strengths of the empire also played a role in military mobilization. It was the satrapal system and the network of postal stations established by Darius that made logistical coordination on such a massive scale possible. Without that administrative infrastructure, this mobilization would have been impossible. This fact reminds us that Xerxes' military campaign relied on the institutional legacy accumulated by his father and grandfather. His ambitions could only take flight on the foundation laid by his predecessors. This is a historical truth worth remembering. The grandest actions in history, which may appear highly individualistic, are often the product of extensive collective institutional accumulation. Xerxes' expedition, on the surface, was an expression of an emperor's will, but at its core, it was the combined result of Cyrus's pioneering efforts, Cambus's continuation, Darius's institutionalization, and the collective labor of countless engineers, administrators, and ordinary soldiers. Ambition requires fertile ground to grow, and that ground is never the creation of any single individual. Another dimension of the preparation was Xerxes' personal declaration. During the planning phase of this expedition, he tied his image to the war in an unprecedented way. He personally inspected the progress of the engineering projects, reviewed the troops, and in Herodotus' account, he was the absolute protagonist of this war. The center of all decisions. Xerxes chose to lead the campaign himself, and this choice was in itself a political statement. This war was not an ordinary border expansion, but the King of Kings personally asserting his vision of world order. It also meant that any failure in this war would be presented as the emperor's own failure, not attributable to the incompetence of his generals. The emperor, leading the campaign personally, meant placing all glory and all risk on the same bet. If he won, the brilliance would be unparalleled. If he lost, the cost would be beyond any means of recovery. In a sense, Xerxes' historical fate after Salamis was a logical extension of this decision to lead the campaign personally. This chapter of preparation history also encompasses a dimension that the Greek narrative framework almost entirely overlooks. What did this mobilization mean for the various peoples within the empire? The stories of the Egyptian soldiers conscripted, the warriors who trekked from the Indus Valley, and those forced to leave their homelands to follow an army whose purpose they may not have truly understood to distant battlefields, all vanish into the silence of history after Herodotus's encyclopedic enumeration. How many of them returned home? We do not know. How many perished on Greek soil in places whose names they could not even utter in their own languages? We do not know. History is always written in the name of the rulers, while the experiences of the ruled form the true flesh and blood of that history. Yet they always linger behind the words in ways we cannot clearly discern. Remembering this fact is the most basic respect historical narratives can offer to the nameless, not by filling ignorance with fiction, but by acknowledging ignorance to preserve a genuine historical place for them. The unnamed soldiers who followed Xerxes on his expedition deserve to be silently present in any narrative of this war. In the autumn of 481 BC, the great army assembled at Doriscus in Thrace. Herodotus recorded that Xerxes conducted a review there and attempted to tally the total number of troops by repeatedly filling an enclosure capable of holding 10,000 men. This detail, regardless of its historical accuracy, presents a fascinating spectacle of an emperor confronting the vast scale he himself had created. He had to employ a special method of measurement to grasp the magnitude of the force he had mobilized. When power reaches a certain magnitude, it exceeds the direct perception of its holder, requiring indirect measuring tools to comprehend its own boundaries. This is a profound metaphor about the nature of power, and Xerxes' counting at Doriscus stands as one of the most concrete historical expressions of this metaphor. When the scale of power surpasses the emperor's direct perception, a rift emerges between him and the reality he rules. He knows the numbers, yet he cannot truly perceive the specific lives, specific sufferings, and specific burdens represented by those numbers. This rift manifests in various forms at every critical decision-making moment thereafter. At Doriscus, Xerxes did one more thing. He held a conversation with the Greek exile Demaratus, which Herodotus recorded at length. Demaratus, a former king of Sparta, had been exiled to the Persian court due to palace intrigues. Xerxes asked him, "Would the Spartans resist?" Demaratus replied, "Yes, even if only 1,000 remained, they would fight." This dialogue is one of the most famous passages in Herodotus's narrative, and also one that requires the most careful handling. It presents a narrative framework in which a wise external observer attempts to warn an arrogant emperor, but is ignored. A framework that aligns closely with Herodotus's overall moral judgment of Xerxes. Therefore, before accepting its dramatic impact, we must first consider its narrative function. This is not to say the conversation never took place, nor that Demaratus's judgment was wrong. His understanding of the Spartans was, in fact, accurate. Rather, it means that within Herodotus's narrative framework, this dialogue is deliberately placed in a position that best serves his moral theme, requiring us to accept both its historical possibility and its narrative construction. Regardless of the historical authenticity of these records, the outcome of the preparations was clear. In the winter of 481 BC, Xerxes led this multi-ethnic coalition army from Asia Minor, crossed the Hellespont pontoon bridge into Europe, and advanced toward Greece. Strategically, this was a military operation with exceptionally thorough preliminary preparations. Supply lines had been planned, provisions had been stockpiled, roads had been repaired, and water sources had been surveyed. If there is one thing Xerxes can be credited with in these preparations, it is his empire's mobilization capability. In that era, No other political entity could have completed war preparations on such a scale within 3 years. This was his genuine achievement, deserving of its proper place in any evaluation of his historical legacy. A historical figure, often simplified as a failed, arrogant tyrant, accomplished something no other ruler in the ancient world had achieved before his downfall. In 3 years, he transformed an empire spanning 3 continents into a war machine aimed at a single objective, successfully setting it in motion, crossing a strait, and entering another continent. Regardless of the outcome, the organizational difficulty of this process should not be easily overlooked. At the moment, the great army crossed the Hellespont. 2 historical narratives were unfolding simultaneously. Xerxes' forces were advancing westward, while the Greek city-states, added to this of Corinth Conference in 481 BC, were engaged in difficult discussions on how to coordinate their resistance. These 2 narratives were destined to converge at Thermopylae. Their convergence would give rise to one of the most symbolic military confrontations of the ancient world. Yet, before this meeting, those on each path could only perceive the logic of their own trajectory. Unaware of the other approaching line, the drama of history often lies in such information asymmetry. 2 groups, each with their own perspective, moving toward an encounter neither could fully foresee. Xerxes knew his army vastly outnumbered the Greek alliance. He did not know what an equalizer the terrain at Thermopylae would prove to be. The Greek alliance knew they were heavily outnumbered. They understood that certain terrain could help offset this disadvantage. Both sides made rational judgments, yet the outcome of history would not align entirely with either's expectations. This chapter marks the strategic engine ignition moment of the entire documentary. From the internal suppression in Egypt and Babylon to 3 years of war preparations, and finally to the army crossing the Hellespont, Xerxes channeled the entire empire's energy into a massive thrust in one direction. At the end of that thrust, what awaited him was not just the 300 at Thermopylae, but a form of resistance his imperial logic had never truly encountered. One that did not rely on a single center, did not collapse with the fall of a capital, and fought against the scaled power of an empire with the fragmented resilience of city-states. How that resistance would unfold and where this encounter would lead is the history to be presented in the next chapter. But before entering that history, the final impression this chapter must leave is this. The preparation for war itself was a test of the limits of human organizational capability, and Xerxes passed that test. In the winter of 481, his empire accomplished a war mobilization on a scale that stunned all observers of the ancient world. A feat never before seen in human history. That achievement, regardless of what followed, was real, and it belonged to him. In the summer of 480 BC, Xerxes' army advanced into northern Greece. They marched through Thrace, crossed Macedonia, and moved south along the coastline, with city-states along the way, submitting one after another. The Thessalians chose to cooperate with the Persians, while most northern city-states opted for silent acceptance. This was not cowardice, but a realistic judgment in the face of overwhelming force. The survival of a city-state could not rely on its own strength to resist an empire. It was only south of that famous pass that resistance truly began to gather. Thermopylae, the narrowest natural pass on the route to central Greece, was wedged between steep cliffs and the coast, with its narrowest point allowing only a few men to pass side by side. King Leonidas of Sparta led 300 Spartan citizen soldiers, along with about 7,000 allied troops from other city-states, to set up defenses there. This took place in the 4th of August 80 BC. The encounter between the two armies would produce one of the most recounted battles of the ancient world. Over the next 2,500 years, this battle was repeatedly retold and reinterpreted, serving the political and cultural needs of various eras. Its historical truth, in this long accumulation of narratives, was both preserved and distorted. This documentary attempts to peel back the layers of these narratives and reconnect with the core closest to the historical event. Before delving into the narrative of this battle, the documentary must pause for a methodological reflection. Thermopylae is one of the most recounted yet unevenly narrated battles in ancient history. Nearly all the details we have about it come from Herodotus, a Greek writing within the cultural milieu of Athens, who understood the war as a pivotal moment in the grand framework of Greek freedom versus Persian despotism. Records from the Persian side of the battle are virtually non-existent. What transpired in Xerxes' camp during his 3 days there? How his commanders assessed the situation, and how he himself viewed the obstacle at that narrow pass. These are largely matters of speculation, filtered through the accounts of his adversaries. This asymmetry is not merely in details, but in the fundamental narrative perspective, a premise that must remain ever present in this chapter. Such asymmetry is no accident. Conquerors typically feel no need to justify their actions, while victorious resistors have every incentive to construct a narrative about the conflict. By the time Herodotus wrote, the triumphs at Marathon and Salamis had become central to Athenian cultural pride, and his narrative, however objective he strove to be, could not entirely escape the gravitational pull of that cultural atmosphere. Let us try to stand in Xerxes' camp and imagine what those 3 days felt like. His vanguard arrived at Thermopylae, only to find a wall of men blocking the path forward. Initial probing attacks were repelled. He sent more elite troops, including, according to Herodotus, the Persian Empire's finest immortals. Yet the result was the same: heavy losses and no breakthrough for an emperor commanding the largest army of the ancient world. This situation was unbelievable. His vast forces were halted by a narrow pass and a few thousand defenders, not because the enemy was stronger, but because the terrain completely neutralized his numerical advantage. For Xerxes, these 3 days were perhaps among the most troubling experiences of his entire campaign. His power, at this specific geographical point, encountered its first real impassable boundary. Elsewhere in the empire, the appearance of an overwhelmingly large army at the gates typically led to submission or swift victory. But at Thermopylae, numerical superiority was utterly negated by an extremely narrow corridor. For an emperor accustomed to determining outcomes through sheer scale, this was a profound and unfamiliar sensation, a moment when power lost its usual effectiveness. What the defenders at Thermopylae did is epic in Herodotus's account. The Spartan hoplites fought continuously in shifts within that narrow corridor, using the terrain to completely neutralize the numerical advantage of the Persian forces. The number of 300 Spartans is one of the central images in Herodotus's narrative. But it must be noted that the actual forces defending Thermopylae included allies from city-states, such as Thebes, Thespi, and Corinth, totaling around 7,000. The 300 were the elite among the finest warriors of their time, an extreme embodiment of the warrior ideal in Spartan culture. However, the notion of 300 men holding Thermopylae alone is a myth that has been continually simplified and purified in retellings rather than an accurate historical description. Myths have their own power, but understanding how this myth formed is as important as understanding the myth itself. The defense by 7,000 has been compressed into a form easier to remember and spread due to the narrative purity of the number 300. This compression is a common mechanism of human narrative memory. We tend to remember the version that is most concise in form and most intense in emotion. 300 is easier to grasp, more evocative of imagination, and more readily becomes a symbolic numerical token than 7,000. History is always condensed in memory in this way. On the third day, a local man named Ephialtes betrayed the Greeks by revealing to Xerxes a mountain path. that bypassed Thermopylae. The Persian forces maneuvered overnight, encircling the Greek position from the rear. Upon learning of this, Leonidas dismissed most of his allies, remaining with 300 Spartans and a few Thespian volunteers who chose to stay for a final stand. All perished. The impact of this outcome resonated throughout the Greek world more profoundly than many victories. A defeat, through the lens of narrative, became an eternal symbol of honor and will. Ephialtes' betrayal left an indelible stain of treachery in Greek tradition. Yet, from another perspective, his choice represented a pragmatic decision, one repeated countless times in history by an ordinary individual facing the immense pressure of an empire. For Ephialtes, the imperial army had arrived. The cost of resistance was clear, and the rewards of cooperation seemed within reach. To label his choice as betrayal is a moral judgment from the victor's narrative viewpoint, from the limited perspective of an ordinary person in that specific moment. His decision followed its own internal logic, though its long-term consequences were beyond his foresight at the time. Xerxes passed through Thermopylae, and then advanced southward into Attica, reaching Athens. By then, Athens was already an empty city. Following Themistocles' advice, the Athenians had evacuated nearly all civilians in advance, relocating them to Salamis and Troezen. Only a few priests guarding the Acropolis and elderly individuals, unable to leave, remained. Xerxes entered the abandoned city and set fire to the Acropolis, including the predecessor of the Parthenon. Athens was burned. According to ancient historical records, this was the only military decision for which Xerxes later explicitly expressed regret. This detail is worth pausing over. Throughout the entire war, among all decisions recorded in historical sources, the burning of Athens was the only action to which he reportedly responded with remorse. This uniqueness, whether the regret was genuine or a narrative construct, indicates that the flames of Athens occupy a distinct position in the war's spectrum of meaning, different from other military actions. Historical note: the account of whether Xerxes regretted burning Athens comes from Herodotus, and its reliability, like all narratives about Xerxes' psychological state, requires cautious handling. However, this detail, regardless of its authenticity, holds significant narrative importance. It breaks the monolithic image of a ruthless tyrant, suggesting that this individual may have retained some awareness of the consequences of his actions while exercising power. The burning of Athens acquired a unique narrative significance in subsequent history. It became the supreme symbolic moment of the war in terms of civilization. 30 years later, the Athenians rebuilt the Acropolis, constructing the Parthenon, which was even more magnificent than the original. Defining this reconstruction as tangible proof of civilization's triumph over barbarism. Another 130 years later, when Alexander the Great conquered Persia and burned Persepolis, he reportedly explicitly defined that burning as a historic retaliation for Xerxes' burning of Athens. Separated by a century and a half, these two burnings echoed each other in historical narratives, forming one of the most symbolically significant symmetrical structures of the ancient world. This structure will be elaborated in detail in Chapter 10 of this film. What must be remembered here is the flame of Athens. It was not merely a military action in a war, but a symbol, the most intense visual expression of the collision between two civilizations. The flame of Athens illuminated the Aegean Sea that summer, and has since illuminated countless narratives about East-West relations over the following 2.5 millennia. It is the most enduring visual trace left by that collision in historical imagination. No matter how we interpret it, that blaze has never truly been extinguished in the memory of history. From the perspective of Persian military logic, Thermopylae was a localized delay rather than a strategic defeat. 3 days of obstruction was an acceptable cost in an expedition lasting several months. Xerxes ultimately breached the defenses, advanced into central Greece, burned Athens, and seized control of vast Greek territories. In this light, the outcome of the Battle of Thermopylae was a tactical Persian victory. They broke through, and the defenders were annihilated. However, the strategic narrative that emerged from this victory stood in stark contrast to its military result. The deaths of Leonidas and the 300 Spartans galvanized the resolve of the Greek city-states to resist, providing an emotional and political foundation for the coordinated efforts at the Battle of Salamis. A military victory can sometimes lead to a strategic defeat in the narrative. This is a profound paradox in the history of warfare. Certain military actions, even when achieving their intended results on the battlefield, can ignite a cohesion among opponents that did not previously exist on a broader political and psychological level. Thermopylae is an extreme case of this paradox. The deaths of the 300 did more to unite the Greek city-states in resistance than their survival ever could. An outcome Xerxes' military logic could neither foresee nor counteract. This battle also has a dimension that the Greek narrative framework can hardly present: the stories of the Persian soldiers who fell at Thermopylae. Herodotus recorded their death toll, which he estimated to be extremely high, a figure modern historians view with great skepticism. But he did not record the name of a single Persian soldier, nor their fears, their families, or their experiences facing trained hoplites in that narrow corridor. They came from every corner of the empire, dying as soldiers in their own languages, in a place whose name they might never have heard. The narrative of war always centers on the stories of the victors, or the heroic defeated. Ordinary deaths remain nameless on both sides, forever anonymous in history. This structural bias in historical writing is not intentional on anyone's part, but is determined by the logic of narrative operation. A story requires identifiable subjects, names, motivations, and details that can be emotionalized. Mass anonymous deaths are narratively silent, for silence has no plot, no arc, no material that can be organized into a narrative. Acknowledging this silence brings us closer to historical truth than filling it with fiction. The subsequent fate of the Battle of Thermopylae in the Western historical imagination is a topic that this chapter must address. From the odes of ancient Greece to the historical writings of the Roman era, the nationalist narratives of modern Europe, and the Hollywood films of the 20th century, the name Thermopylae has come to carry an increasing number of meanings that were not originally its own. It has been used to symbolize the few against the many, to support narratives of civilization against barbarism, and to serve various political purposes. The portrayal of Xerxes in Hollywood films as a mythologized divine king stands in stark contrast to the devout follower of Ahura Mazda, depicted in Persian inscriptions. A gap that is dizzying. This is not merely artistic simplification, but a systematic rewriting of historical materials driven by the narrative needs of a civilization's self-identity. Each era extracts from the story of Thermopylae the meaning it requires at the time, and each extraction adds a new layer of interpretation to the tale. The accumulation of these interpretations is how cultural memory operates. It does not preserve the past, but uses it to construct the present. Understanding this mechanism is not to negate the historical significance of Thermopylae, but to gain a clearer understanding of where its meaning truly originates. The question of when the narrative framework of the Persian Wars as a struggle between freedom and despotism became solidified in history is worth considering. This framework took shape in Athenian political propaganda shortly after the war ended. During the era of Pericles, Athens defined its victory in the Persian Wars as proof of the superiority of its democratic system. The reconstruction of the Parthenon served as the architectural expression of this self-narrative. This narrative served internally to strengthen the cohesion of the Athenian Empire, and externally to support Athens' claim to leadership in the Greek world. It was political, not merely historical. When we read today that the Greeks defended freedom, what we encounter is the result of this political narrative, accumulating over a 2,500-year chain of transmission, not just the facts of what happened in the summer of 480 BCE. This is not to say that Greek freedom was illusory. Rather, elevating a specific military conflict into a universal symbol of civilization is a narrative operation with specific historical origins and political motivations, not a process in which historical facts naturally reveal their meaning. Every time we invoke Thermopylae, we participate in this narrative operation, consciously or unconsciously. From the perspective of the Persian Empire, the nature of this war was entirely different. Xerxes' inscriptions, those words left at Persepolis that speak in his own voice, never mention the Greek campaign, never define it as a decisive clash of civilizations, and never employ any imperial rhetoric equivalent to freedom versus tyranny. For the Persian Empire, this was a punitive expedition against rebellious forces on the frontier. Athens and Sparta had supported the rebels during the Ionian Revolt, challenging imperial authority, and this had to be answered. This narrative is incompatible with the Greek narrative on almost every level. And it is in the space between these two narratives that historical truth most likely resides. A space where any honest historical account must remain suspended. This suspension is not indecision, nor is it an avoidance of taking a stance. It is a respect for the complexity of history, a refusal to replace the true density of historical reality with the simplicity of any single narrative. Both narratives are the genuine voices of real people, each containing authentic perceptions of their own circumstances. Their incompatibility does not need to be resolved, but must be presented as it is. The naval battle of Artemisium, which took place concurrently with the land battle at Thermopylae, marked the first large-scale maritime engagement of the war. Artemisium is a cape at the northern tip of the island of Euboea, where the Greek fleet clashed with the Persian fleet over several days. The outcome was an inconclusive war of attrition, with the Greek fleet voluntarily withdrawing after the fall of Thermopylae to regroup at Salamis. This naval battle is often overshadowed by the legendary status of Thermopylae in historical narratives. Yet, its strategic significance lies in demonstrating that the Greek fleet could hold its own against the Persian navy in direct confrontation. This provided the confidence for Themistocles to later choose to engage decisively at Salamis. War is a system of countless interconnected events, not a series of isolated heroic moments. Artemisium taught the Greek fleet how to counter Persia's numerical advantage in confined waters, a lesson applied 2 weeks later in the Strait of Salamis. The course of history is never shaped by a single dramatic moment alone, but rather by the complex interplay of numerous seemingly smaller events, each altering a parameter on the larger strategic chessboard. After the Battle of Thermopylae, Xerxes faced the following strategic situation. He controlled central and northern Greece, had burned Athens, and there were no remaining land defenses to stop him. However, the Greek fleet remained intact, assembled in the straits near the island of Salamis. His supply lines stretched all the way to the Hellespont, and as the season progressed, they would face increasing logistical pressure. He needed a decisive naval victory to transform the expedition from merely controlling Greek territory into conquering Greece. Thus, Salamis was not just a naval battle, but the strategic pivot of the entire war. A victory would allow the Greek campaign to conclude that year, while a defeat would fundamentally shake the strategic foundation of the entire expedition. This asymmetry lay at the core of Xerxes' strategic vulnerability. He could endure multiple local advances without achieving a final decisive victory, but he could hardly withstand a single critical naval defeat. His opponents, meanwhile, were already leveraging this asymmetry to design the location and method of the next battle. Themistocles' choice of the Strait of Salamis was no accident. It was a precise interpretation of Xerxes' strategic predicament and a comprehensive application of the information accumulated from every encounter since Thermopylae. This chapter seeks a balance between the historical account and narrative analysis of two battles. Thermopylae is the segment of this documentary that most requires the simultaneous presentation of two aspects. First, the true nature of the battle in military history, including its scale, participants, and tactical details. Second, the fate of the battle in historical narratives, including how it has been recounted, mythologized, and used to serve various political purposes. These two aspects should not replace each other, but should illuminate one another. The clearer the actual history, the more visible the mechanisms of myth-making become. The clearer the mechanisms of myth-making, the deeper our understanding of the universal patterns of historical narratives. Thus, Thermopylae is not merely a battle but a lesson in how historical memory operates. The content of this lesson holds direct reference value for understanding the narrative fate of all significant historical events. Any sufficiently dramatic historical event will be repeatedly appropriated in later narrative practices, laden with symbolic weight beyond its original significance. Understanding this process is fundamental to grasping the relationship between history and ourselves. And Thermopylae serves as an exceptionally clear entry point to this understanding. At the end of this chapter, let us return to the simplest image. Xerxes, after Thermopylae, entered a burning Athens. He stood there, facing the flames, facing the ruins of the city he had spent 3 years and mobilized the entire might of his empire to reach. He had won, he had arrived. But the citizens of Athens were no longer there. The Athenian fleet had already gathered at Salamis, and the will of Athens no longer resided in any structure that could be burned. What he burned were stones and wood, not the thing he truly sought to conquer, that thing. A spirit of resistance, not dependent on a single location, was waiting for him in the narrow strait. In the next chapter, Xerxes was about to face not just a fleet, but a strategic design. Terrain carefully chosen by his opponent. Strategic weaknesses meticulously exploited by his adversary, and an opponent who, though numerically inferior, had already seized tactical initiative. That strait would become the turning point of his entire campaign, and that turning point would be fully revealed in the next chapter. In the 4th of September 80 BC, Xerxes ordered a throne to be erected for him on the shore opposite the island of Salamis. He intended to witness the naval battle with his own eyes, watching his fleet annihilate Greece's last organized resistance in that narrow strait. This choice, to sit and watch from a high vantage point rather than wait for reports from the rear, was an extension of the logic behind his personal campaign. This war was his war, and his glory or shame would be directly tied to its outcome. What he did not know was that he was about to witness the naval battle in a way no victorious emperor would ever choose. He would sit there, watching his fleet sink, one ship after another, before his very eyes. The most powerful man in the world, on that particular afternoon, sat at the highest point, watching his power disintegrate at a pace he could not stop. This was Salamis in the 4th of September 80 BC. Among all the battles of the ancient world, few compressed the pinnacle of power and its collapse into the same visual scene in such a dramatic manner. The emperor present, witnessing with his own eyes, yet powerless to intervene. That throne, on that afternoon, was not a symbol of power, but a spectator's seat to its unraveling. Before entering this naval battle, we need to understand why Themistocles chose the Strait of Salamis, instead of an open water frontal confrontation. This choice was the strategic premise for the outcome of the entire battle. The narrowest point of the Strait of Salamis is about 1.5 kilometers wide, with complex terrain on both sides and water conditions that are extremely unfavorable for the deployment of a large fleet. The numerical advantage of the Persian fleet was overwhelming in open waters. But in this narrow strait, that advantage would be systematically neutralized by the terrain, much like how the land corridor at Thermopylae neutralized the numerical advantage of the Persian army. Themistocles understood a key vulnerability in Xerxes' strategic situation. The empire needed a quick victory, and this desire for a swift resolution could be used to guide the empire onto a battlefield unfavorable to it. This strategic insight was the core of Themistocles' entire plan for Salamis. It was not a direct confrontation of strength, but a precise exploitation of the opponent's desire structure, using the opponent's urgent desire to win to lead them into a place where they could not win. This strategic logic of overcoming strength with weakness has profound echoes in military history. Regarding how Xerxes was lured into the decisive battle at the Strait of Salamis, Herodotus recorded a famous story. Themistocles secretly sent a message to Xerxes, claiming that the Greek alliance was internally divided, with the Athenians ready to defect, and advised Xerxes to immediately block the exit of the strait to annihilate the Greek fleet. Xerxes believed this message and ordered his fleet to blockade the strait at night, preventing the Greek fleet from retreating, which was precisely what Themistocles truly wanted to draw the Persian fleet into the carefully chosen battleground. This story, whether true or not, reveals an ancient truth about information warfare in war. An opponent's ability to process information is as crucial as their military strength. An overwhelmingly large fleet, if misled by false information into the wrong battlefield, not only loses its numerical advantage, but may even turn it into a disadvantage. Because the more ships enter a narrow strait, the greater the chaos. Historical note: the authenticity of this story has long been debated. Supporters argue that such deceptive tactics had precedence in ancient warfare, and the course of events aligns closely with this narrative. Skeptics point out that the story is overly dramatic and serves the theme of clever Greeks outwitting arrogant Persians. Regardless of its veracity, the outcome was that the Persian fleet entered the strait at dawn, exactly where Themistocles awaited them. At dawn, the Persian fleet sailed into the Strait of Salamis. As they entered, the Greek fleet was already arrayed and waiting deep within the narrow bay. The leading ships of the Persian fleet, unable to fully deploy in the confined waters, were followed by a continuous stream of vessels, creating a chaotic crush and disarray at the front. The Greek triremes, with their lighter hulls and greater maneuverability, held a distinct advantage in such close-quarters combat. The pace of the battle quickly shifted to the kind the Greeks had hoped for: one on, one ramming and grappling, rather than large-scale fleet maneuvers. Under these conditions, the numerical superiority of the Persian fleet turned from an asset into a burden. More ships in the narrow strait meant more congestion, not greater combat strength. This is a recurring paradox in the history of warfare. Under specific circumstances, more can equal less. Numbers translate into combat power only when they can be effectively deployed and coordinated. And the Strait of Salamis precisely deprived the Persians of this condition. That morning, the terrain itself was the Greeks' most powerful weapon. Xerxes sat on his throne, watching it all unfold. It was a profoundly historic scene. An emperor witnessing the collapse of his strategy in a way he could not intervene. He could not command the waves to change direction, nor order the strait to widen, nor effectively transfer the authority he was accustomed to wielding on land into the chaotic fray upon the water. His commanders were doing what they could in that strait. But under those geographical conditions, it was not enough to win the battle. According to Herodotus, whenever Xerxes saw a Persian ship perform well, he recorded the name of its commander. Whenever he saw a ship retreat, he noted another name, for later rewards or accountability. This detail portrays an emperor under extreme pressure, still striving to maintain a sense of control. Recording names was an act of imposing order onto chaos. When the overall situation had spiraled beyond control, at least the individual performances could be recorded, judged, and held accountable afterward. This psychological mechanism of seeking localized control amid chaos is a common human response to disaster, and Xerxes expressed it in the manner of an emperor, one of the few effective tools of power he had left that afternoon. The outcome of this naval battle, described in military terms, was a decisive victory for the Greek alliance. The Persian fleet suffered significant losses, withdrew from the Strait of Salamis, and lost the capability to continue effective operations for the remainder of that campaign season. However, when understanding the historical significance of this victory, it is essential to distinguish between several levels. First, this was a victory in a naval battle, not the end of the entire war. Xerxes' army remained intact, commanded by Mardonius, and stayed in Greece over the winter, preparing to resume the campaign the following year. Second, this victory did not immediately expel the Persian forces from Greece, as Athens remained under Persian control until the end of that year. Third, and most importantly, this victory altered the strategic dynamics of the entire war, rendering the Persian objective of completing the conquest of Greece within the year impossible. Distinguishing these three levels is crucial for accurately understanding the historical significance of Salamis. Interpreting it as the end of the Greco-Persian Wars is a common narrative oversimplification. Viewing it as a decisive turning point in the war's momentum more closely aligns with its true place in strategic history. A turning point and an end point are fundamentally different things. Now let's delve into the most crucial historical reinterpretation of this chapter. Was Xerxes' retreat an act of fleeing? Within the Greek narrative framework, there is almost a predetermined answer. Yes, the arrogant emperor fled in panic after his defeat, abandoning his army in a foreign land. However, when we examine this decision to retreat from the perspective of an imperial administrator, it takes on an entirely different appearance. The strategic realities Xerxes faced were as follows. The navy had been severely damaged and could not be reorganized into an effective fighting force in the near future. The army's supply lines depended on logistical channels maintained across the Hellespont pontoon bridge. Winter was approaching, and logistical conditions in northern Greece would deteriorate sharply, and his prolonged stay at the front was not without risks to the stability of other regions of the empire. This last point, often overlooked, may have been one of the most important considerations. An empire spanning 3 continents required an emperor capable of handling state affairs in the capital. An emperor who became increasingly entrenched on the battlefield was politically vulnerable. His absence could create opportunities for power realignments within the court, and such opportunities would manifest in an extremely bloody manner in the history following Xerxes. Xerxes left Mardonius behind with what he considered the most elite land forces to winter in Greece and prepare to continue the campaign the following year. This arrangement is key to understanding his decision to withdraw. He had not abandoned the Greek campaign, but was making a strategic adjustment, partial continuation of the war, rather than full-scale retreat. More accurately describes his strategic choice after Salamis. This understanding does not alter the strategic significance of Salamis. Mardonius ultimately met his complete defeat at the Battle of Plataea the following year, and the Greek campaign ended in final failure for the Persians. However, it changes our perception of Xerxes as a person. He was not someone who collapsed in the face of defeat, but rather one who still attempted strategic reorganization in adversity. Even though that reorganization ultimately failed, the total annihilation at Plataea was the final cost of the decision chain that began at Salamis. Yet, this later outcome does not retroactively prove that the decision to leave Mardonius behind was wrong at the time. After Salamis, seeking a turnaround by continuing the war with land forces was a strategically reasonable choice, even if it ultimately did not succeed. After Salamis, Xerxes withdrew to Asia, reportedly completing this long retreat in a relatively short time. Herodotus describes this retreat with a tone of moral irony. The emperor's hasty departure forms a stark narrative contrast with the grand spectacle of his arrival. However, we must remind ourselves once again that this contrast is constructed by someone writing from the perspective of the victorious side. The speed of the retreat may reflect logistical urgency rather than psychological panic. For an emperor managing an empire spanning 3 continents, swiftly returning to the capital after a major military defeat is a comprehensible political and administrative decision, not necessarily a flight. Assigning narrative meaning to this retreat is itself a choice of narrative stance. Herodotus chose hasty departure, while a narrator from the imperial administrative standpoint might write, "The emperor promptly returned to the capital to handle imperial affairs after the setback in battle." The same facts can yield vastly different meanings within different narrative frameworks. This is not to say that any narrative is equally valid. The details of the facts themselves can support or refute certain narratives, but rather that we need to be aware of what kind of narrative we are reading and what interpretive framework it serves. Salamis quickly became a foundational moment for Athenian democracy in subsequent Greek historical narratives. The Athenian triumphs were voted for construction by citizens in the assembly under the democratic system, and the victory was won with the bodies of the common people. The rowers, most of whom came from Athens' poorest classes. After Salamis, Themistocles became one of the most influential politicians in Athens, and his victory was interpreted as proof of the superior mobilizing capacity of the Athenian democratic system. This narrative has a basis in truth. Athenian democratic decision making did enable Themistocles' strategy to be implemented. However, interpreting it simply as democracy triumphing over autocracy is an oversimplification that obscures the complex political maneuvering and military coordination within the Greek city. State alliance, the role of Sparta at Salamis, the participation of the Peloponnesian League, and the ongoing friction between Athens and Sparta over command. These are details that cannot be accommodated by the tidy narrative of democracy triumphing over autocracy. The truth of history has always been more complex than any single themed narrative, and that complexity is its most precious epistemological value. From the perspective opposite Salamis, what did this defeat mean for Xerxes? His inscriptions make no mention of the battle, and no Persian self-narratives about Salamis survive in his court archives. He experienced this defeat, then returned to Persepolis, ruling for nearly 15 more years, continuing to build palaces and asserting his legitimacy in inscriptions as a devout follower of Ahura Mazda. His public image, after Salamis, shows no discernible collapse that we can identify. This in itself is a limited but genuine signal about the inner world of this man. Defeat left no recognizable trace in the public records he left behind. This fact, in itself, is a valuable historical signal about the relationship between the psychology of ancient emperors and their public image. The emperor's inscriptions are not private diaries, but political documents. They record the self the emperor wished to be remembered, not the true fluctuations of his inner world. The absence of Salamis in the inscriptions may be one of the clearest expressions of this management of public image. The specific tactical details of the Battle of Salamis remain relatively obscure in historical records. We know the general outcome, some key participants, that the battle took place on an autumn morning, and that the Greek fleet, though numerically inferior, achieved a decisive victory. However, the precise sequence of events, the exact movements of individual ships, and which decisions proved critical at which moments, these aspects cannot be accurately reconstructed from the existing historical sources. This uncertainty represents a boundary that honest historical narrators must acknowledge. Many specific details about Salamis are historical inferences rather than established facts, and no matter how meticulously crafted, such inferences remain separated from historical reality by an irreducible gap. This gap is more pronounced for the Battle of Salamis than for many other historical events. Because the battle occurred on water, the battlefield itself left no physical traces. Nearly all testimonies come from the victorious side, while accounts from the defeated are entirely absent. Our understanding of Salamis is constructed from a state of specific informational asymmetry, a limitation that honest historical narration must recognize. Artemisia is a figure impossible to overlook in the narrative of Salamis. As the Queen of Caria, she participated in the battle with 5 warships in her capacity as a vassal monarch, making her the only female commander in the entire Persian fleet. Herodotus records that Xerxes witnessed her ship sinking a vessel during the naval battle. The sunken ship was in fact an allied Persian vessel, which she rammed and sank in the chaos to escape pursuit by the Greek fleet. Xerxes, however, mistakenly believed she had sunk a Greek ship and uttered the famous words, "My men have become women, and my women have become men." Regardless of its historical accuracy, this story serves a crucial function in Herodotus's narrative. It simultaneously mocks Xerxes' error in judgment and presents a complex female figure who defies gender expectations. Artemisia is one of the few women in Herodotus's account endowed with genuine intellect and agency, and she appears precisely on the Persian side. This adds a layer of complexity to Herodotus's narrative that transcends simple ethnic opposition in terms of gender, making her one of the most memorable marginal figures in the story of this war. Plataea was the inevitable extension of Salamis. In 479 BC, the Persian army led by Mardonius clashed with the Greek coalition forces commanded by the Spartan general Pausanias on the plains of Plataea in what became the largest land battle of the Greco-Persian Wars. The Persian forces collapsed across the board, Mardonius was killed, and the remnants of the army withdrew from Greece. On the same day, according to records, the Greek coalition launched an amphibious assault on the remaining Persian fleet at Mycale in Asia Minor, effectively ending the Persian naval presence in the Aegean Sea. The Greco-Persian Wars, in a military sense, came to a close with these two nearly simultaneous battles. Xerxes' Greek campaign ended in failure with the complete annihilation of the army he left behind under Mardonius. From the completion of preparations in 480 BC and the invasion of Europe to the total collapse at Plataea in 479 BC, the entire Greek campaign lasted nearly 2 years. During those 2 years, the empire mobilized all the resources it could muster, incurring immeasurable human and material costs, only to withdraw from the Greek peninsula with a decisive defeat. That cost is something no historical narrative, regardless of scale, can fully capture. Salamis serves as the narrative core of the entire Xerxes documentary. It is the climactic moment of the film, the pivotal point on Xerxes' arc of power between its zenith and the beginning of its decline. However, this turning point is not merely a tale of failure, nor is it a straightforward narrative of moral retribution. The Greek moral framework, where arrogance inevitably leads to downfall, must here be replaced by a more nuanced understanding. What Xerxes encountered at Salamis was something his imperial logic had never truly prepared for. An opponent who meticulously designed the battlefield, one who used his strategic ambitions as a tool. An adversary who, though numerically inferior, held the strategic initiative. Failure can sometimes be a matter of strength, but at Salamis, it was more a matter of judgment and strategic design. Xerxes' fleet still held a numerical advantage, and the quality of his individual warships was not inferior. His defeat came from launching an attack on a battlefield, carefully crafted by his opponent in a manner the opponent had anticipated. This kind of failure carries a special weight in military history. It demonstrates that strategic design can systematically overcome disparities in strength. This chapter begins with Xerxes seated on his throne, overlooking the strait. Let us end with the same image, but armed with the knowledge of what followed. He sits there, on that autumn morning, watching his fleet enter the strait he may have realized was too late to alter. He watches, unable to stop, unable to intervene, unable to change what is unfolding on the water with any of the instruments of power at his disposal as emperor. That moment of powerlessness is the most concrete historical embodiment of this documentary's central thesis on the nature of power. When power encounters its own structural limits, it becomes merely a spectator. That limit, at Salamis, was the product of terrain, strategic design, and historical timing. On a deeper level, it was also a specific manifestation of the overarching theme, the mightiest empire encountering a boundary it could not conquer. At Salamis, that boundary revealed itself with undeniable historical clarity for the first time. At Thermopylae, the boundary was briefly presented by the terrain, then circumvented. At Salamis, the boundary emerged, and this time there was no detour to overcome her. In the next chapter, the lens will shift from the strait back to Persepolis, back to the stones and inscriptions, back to another Xerxes, one who left traces of his existence in his own language, beyond the narrative of Herodotus. After Salamis, Xerxes returned to Persepolis. The failure of the Greek campaign left almost no trace in the public records. He left behind his inscriptions, both before and after the defeat, used the same language, the same theological framework, and the same self-proclamation. A devout follower of Ahura Mazda, a defender of order, the King of Kings. This continuity was not a disguise, nor merely a political performance, but something deeper. It indicated that, in Xerxes' worldview, the failure of the Greek campaign did not shake his core belief in the legitimacy of his rule. The inscriptions are the most direct voice he could leave for posterity. And that voice, after Salamis, remained steady, consistent, and filled with religious conviction. The 6th chapter of this documentary will delve into that voice, into the stones of Persepolis, to seek another Xerxes, the Xerxes who is almost absent from Herodotus' writings. Persepolis, known in ancient Persian as Parsa, meaning city of the Persians, was the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire. It was not the center of daily administration. That role belonged to Susa and Ecbatana, where official documents were processed, envoys were received, and strategic decisions were discussed. The function of Persepolis was ceremonial during the Nowruz festival at the spring equinox each year. Representatives from the empire's provinces ascended the famous staircase to present tributes and gifts to the emperor. This city was a stage where power proclaimed itself to the entire empire in the most magnificent architectural language. Darius initiated its construction. Xerxes expanded it on a grand scale and left behind some of its most monumental individual structures. The architectural legacy he left at Persepolis is the most reliable material evidence for understanding his self-perception, closer to his own inner language than any narrative filtered through others. Architecture does not lie, does not serve the moral narratives of later generations, and is not rewritten by the defeat of a war. It simply stands there, in the form it was originally built, carrying everything its creators intended to express. The first visual anchor, the gate of all nations, built by Xerxes. This gate, whose name in Old Persian means Gate of All Nations, served as the main entrance to the ceremonial space of Persepolis, flanked by colossal stone sculptures of bulls standing several meters tall. It blends artistic elements from Persia, Assyria, and Egypt, serving as a visual declaration of the empire's capacity to absorb diverse cultures. More importantly, the inscriptions preserved on the gate feature Xerxes writing in the first person. By the grace of Ahura Mazda, it was he who commanded the construction of this gate. The tone of the inscription is pious, solemn, and imbued with a sense of order. The stark contrast between this depiction of Xerxes and the tyrant portrayed by Herodotus, who whipped the sea and embodied boundless arrogance, has deeply astonished modern historians. Both images are products of historical evidence. Both are real, yet they are almost impossible to reconcile. This irreconcilability is both the challenge and the allure of historical research. A sufficiently complex individual reveals different facets across various types of evidence, and the sum of these facets brings us closer to the truth. The Xerxes of the Gate of All Nations must coexist with Herodotus's Xerxes to form a more complete historical image. The second visual anchor, the staircase reliefs, flanking the grand staircase leading to the Persepolis palace complex, are meticulously carved processional reliefs, depicting tribute delegations from across the empire. Egyptians bearing jewelry, Babylonians with textiles, Indians carrying gold dust, Scythians with horses, Nubians presenting ivory. Approximately 23 distinct peoples, each precisely rendered with their unique attire, hairstyles, and offerings. This is not a scene of conquest, but one of pluralistic order. Diverse peoples, in organized procession, presenting tributes to the heart of the empire, which in return offers protection and governance. The contrast between this visual language and the image of Persian tyranny, constructed by Greek narratives, stands as one of archaeology's most powerful challenges to historical storytelling. If the Persian Empire were truly nothing more than a despotic machine fueled by fear and coercion, for whom were these exquisitely crafted reliefs? These tribute delegations endowed with dignity and individuality. Intended, their very existence serves as a testament to the empire's self-perception. An empire that envisioned itself as an integrator of diverse civilizations, not merely a conqueror. The third visual anchor, the Xerxes inscription, XPAs. This is one of the most significant surviving inscriptions, personally authorized by Xerxes, discovered at Persepolis, and inscribed in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. In the inscription, Xerxes declares his identity with an impressive theological solemnity. He is a devout follower of Ahura Mazda, a defender of goodness and order, Asha, and his rule is an extension of divine will on earth. There is not a single line of boasting about military conquests, no denigration of conquered peoples, and none of the Herodotian tone of arrogance. This Xerxes is concerned with religious purity, imperial order, and the responsibilities he bears within the sacred cosmic order. His inscription does not glorify military victories, enumerate conquered cities, or assert authority through the scale of violence. Themes that are extremely common in the royal inscriptions of the ancient Near East. Instead, Xerxes' inscription chooses another language of declaration, a theological, cosmic language centered on the core values of goodness and order. This choice reflects the cultural temperament he shared with his father and ancestors, as well as an expression of his deepest self-perception. The architecture of Persepolis also carries profound symbolic significance in its choice of materials. The palace complex was primarily constructed using gray limestone, transported from dozens of kilometers away, representing an astonishing feat of engineering. The construction process left behind administrative records, the Persepolis fortification tablets, written in Elamite, which document the distribution of rations to thousands of artisans, laborers, and administrative personnel. These archives are among the most important primary sources on the Achaemenid Empire, and provide the most direct evidence of the empire's administrative operations during the reign of Xerxes. What they reveal is not the image of a tyrant relying on enslaved labor to build palaces, but rather a sophisticated system of labor management and compensation. Artisans received rations according to their skill levels, hailing from various parts of the empire, including craftsmen from Greece. This last detail holds particular historical significance. During a time when Xerxes was either engaged in or preparing for war with Greek city-states, Greek artisans were receiving rations and completing projects at his palace construction site. At the level of the empire's daily administration, war never amounted to a complete civilizational isolation. People, technology, and culture continue to flow in various ways through the cracks of conflict. This flow is part of the historical reality of the empire, a detail that cannot be accommodated by any simplistic narrative of civilizational confrontation. The discrepancy between these administrative archives and the image of Xerxes depicted in Greek literature forms the core tension of this chapter. In Herodotus's narrative, the Persian Empire is portrayed as a despotic system operating through fear and coercion, while the administrative archives reveal a bureaucratic system coordinating thousands of laborers through rations, records, and hierarchical management. Both images are products of genuine historical evidence, each pointing to a reality that once existed. Their inconsistency does not stem from one being false, but from their descriptions of different layers of the same complex reality, a system that could simultaneously rely on authoritative deterrence at the macro level and meticulous administrative management at the micro level. This coexistence is not a contradiction but a common logic in the operation of large empires. Deterrence provides the overarching framework, while administration ensures daily functioning. Reducing the Persian Empire to a mere machine of fear or interpreting it as a purely benevolent manager is an oversimplification. Its truth lies somewhere between, perhaps more in the simultaneity of both deterrence and management operating concurrently at different levels of the same empire. The construction projects undertaken by Xerxes at Persepolis surpassed in scale any single building project from the time of Darius. The Hall of 100 Columns stands as one of his most significant architectural legacies, a massive palace supported by 100 stone pillars, covering an area of approximately 7,000 square meters, making it the largest single structure at Persepolis. While its exact function remains debated among scholars, the most plausible explanation is that it served as a space for grand royal receptions, where the emperor showcased his authority to visitors through the most spectacular architectural scale. In an era without steel structures, the construction of 100 pillars required extremely precise engineering calculations and construction organization. Xerxes' creation of this hall was an act of materializing power in space, not merely for practical use, but to ensure that anyone entering the space would first perceive the magnitude of power through their physical senses. In an age without mass media, architecture was the most effective medium for proclaiming authority. It could not be ignored and had to be experienced on a bodily scale. The spatial sensation created by the 100 pillars was the most direct way for the emperor to convey his message of power to visitors, and it remains a historical perception that we can still partially experience through imagination today. The architectural style of Persepolis is a conscious synthesis of diverse elements. The design of the column capitals blends Egyptian palm motifs with Ionic volutes. The decoration of the gateways draws inspiration from Assyrian winged bulls and Egyptian scarabs. The use of color in the murals is deeply connected to Babylonian traditions. This synthesis is not an accidental eclecticism, but rather an imperial architectural politics. a visual language proclaiming the empire as the inheritor and integrator of all these civilizational traditions. This self-positioning as an integrator aligns with the consistent political stance of the Achaemenid dynasty since the Cyrus Declaration, although Xerxes deviated from this tradition in his Babylonian policies. In architectural language, he faithfully continued that visual declaration of pluralistic integration. This continuity raises an intriguing question. While Xerxes' architecture speaks the language of pluralistic integration, some of his policy choices, such as his handling of Babylon, deviated from this language. This inconsistency may be one of the most revealing entry points for understanding Xerxes, not as a monolithic figure of unwavering consistency, but as a complex individual marked by internal tensions. As we stand before these reliefs and inscriptions, a methodological question becomes urgent. What distinct epistemological status do architecture and inscriptions hold as historical evidence compared to written narratives? Written narratives, whether by Herodotus or the inscriptions of Xerxes, are intentional expressions. They tell us, to some extent, what the author wants us to know, not necessarily the entirety of their true experiences. Architecture, in a sense, possesses a nature closer to evidence of action. It is physically constructed, requiring real resources, real labor, and real organizational capabilities, and cannot be entirely disguised by intention. The very existence of Persepolis is an indisputable material testament to the empire's actual capabilities, regardless of how we interpret the motivations of those who built it. This epistemological advantage of action evidence is often underestimated in historical research. We are more accustomed to interpreting texts whose intentionality makes them more easily manipulated and harder to trust. Architecture, of course, also carries intentionality, but its material existence cannot be entirely controlled by intention. Persepolis stands as a historical testimony that transcends any narrative. Xerxes' faith is presented in his inscriptions with a tangible, palpable force. He does not merely invoke the names of the gods as a matter of routine. His inscriptions possess a theological depth uncommon in the documents of ancient monarchs. He clearly distinguishes between Asha truth order and drudge falsehood. Chaos is explicitly positioning his rule as a divine mission to advance Asha in the human realm. This religious depth perhaps explains the religious rigidity he displayed in certain policy choices, including his handling of the Marduk cult in Babylon. An emperor who genuinely believes he is carrying out the task of an agent of cosmic good when faced with a sacred order he perceives as belonging to the camp of drudge, acts with a conviction that cannot be explained by ordinary political considerations. This religious certainty is a double-edged sword. It grants the ruler the power and sense of direction for action, while also instilling in him a rigidity born of faith in situations that might otherwise require flexibility. Xerxes' handling of the Babylonian issue may well be the product of the collision between this religious rigidity and the demands of imperial political elasticity. Persepolis was burned down by Alexander the Great in 330 BC. This destruction marked the symbolic end of the Achaemenid Empire and stands as one of the most devastating cultural acts in history. The architectural achievements accumulated over the lifetime of Xerxes lost their functional existence in that great fire, but not their historical existence. Ruins, at times, speak more eloquently than intact structures. Today, the ruins of Persepolis are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. The reliefs, inscriptions, and surviving capitals still tell a story that does not fit within the Greek narrative framework. The story of an empire in its own language about order, diversity, and divine mission. Alexander's fire consumed the wooden parts of the palace, but could not burn the stone. And those stones, in there too, and a half millennia of silence await those willing to read them with non-Greek eyes. Modern Iranian historians and archaeologists are doing just that, and their work is one of the most important academic sources for this documentary. In the years following the defeat in the Greek campaign, Xerxes continued to build and preside over ceremonies at Persepolis, which in itself was a political statement. The empire did not cease to function because of a single battle's loss, nor did the emperor lose control over the empire's core affairs due to Salamis. He remained the king of kings, still receiving tributes from the provinces during Nowruz, and still presenting himself as the agent of Ahura Mazda in inscriptions. That 15-year period of post-Salamis rule is often described in history as the beginning of decline. But from the material evidence at Persepolis, it also serves as proof of the empire's continued symbolic and institutional operation. Here, defeat did not equate to collapse. This distinction is crucial for understanding the historical significance of Xerxes. Historical narratives tend to define major defeats as turning points for an individual or a civilization, and Salamis' role in the narrative of Xerxes is often a product of this definition. However, the material evidence from Persepolis offers a different narrative. The defeat was real, the cost was heavy, but the empire's daily operations continued for a considerable time after that failure. This chapter marks the clearest shift in historical perspective throughout the entire documentary. It transitions from the Greek viewpoint of Thermopylae and Salamis to the Persian perspective of the Persepolis inscriptions and architecture. This shift is not intended to defend Xerxes nor to negate the value of the Greek narrative, but to fulfill a promise made in the documentary's outline, to seek and present the nearly submerged Persian voice within the historical narrative of Xerxes, which has been overwhelmingly dominated by Greek historians. That voice lies in stone, in inscriptions, in the numbers of administrative documents waiting to be seen anew, not as a rebuttal to the Greek narrative, but as the other half essential for understanding a complete historical figure. The integrity of history does not come from finding a single, ultimately correct narrative, but from listening to as many different voices as possible and maintaining an honest tension among them. In its 6th chapter, this documentary strives to listen to that voice in the stone with the utmost honesty. The inscriptions at Persepolis provide us with the rarest kind of historical material for this documentary. A Xerxes who speaks in his own words. Not the Xerxes described by Herodotus, nor the Eastern tyrant of Greek moral narratives, but an emperor who declared in the name of Ahura Mazda and claimed the order of a Shah. This emperor believed he was doing the right thing, believed his power had a divine source, and believed the order of the empire was an earthly extension of cosmic good. This belief made his actions internally consistent within his own logical framework. And that logical framework, regardless of how we evaluate it today, deserves to be seriously understood rather than simply dismissed as arrogance or tyranny. Serious understanding does not equate to agreement. It merely means truly entering that person's world and viewing the problems he faced through the cognitive framework he possessed, before making any judgment. This is the basic requirement of historical empathy and the prerequisite for any meaningful historical judgment. In this sense, the Xerxes in the inscriptions is an indispensable gateway to understanding historical figures. This chapter concludes with the stones of Persepolis. These stones, having witnessed Xerxes' construction, Alexander's destruction, 2.5 millennia of wind, sand, and earthquakes, were later rediscovered, reinterpreted, and understood by modern archaeology. They still stand today, on the plains of southern Iran, on the land Xerxes once regarded as the center of the universe. They stand not as relics of a defeated empire, but as proof of the intricate complexity of a civilization that once truly existed, a civilization that, in its own language, inscribed on those stones, an understanding of power, order, and divine will entirely distinct from the Greek narrative. That understanding deserves to be heard. In the next chapter, we will delve into another dimension of the Xerxes narrative, the workings of power within the court, the shadows of the harem, and the records of his private life. Records that will once again draw us back into the framework of the Greek narrative, testing our ability to distinguish historical fact from narrative construction. But before entering that dimension, the stones of Persepolis must be remembered. There, an emperor, in the language he knew best, left his final definition of himself, carved in stone, an inscription. All power has its private dimension, beyond the inscriptions and architecture of Persepolis, and amidst the military campaigns recorded by Herodotus, there lies another facet of Xerxes' life, the daily workings of power within the court, the political dynamics of the harem, the loyalties and betrayals among family members, and how a man wielding absolute authority navigated his closest relationships. This dimension is the most obscure and easily misinterpreted aspect of all historical narratives about Xerxes. The issue of historical sources reaches its peak here. Accounts of Xerxes' private life almost entirely originate from Greek texts, particularly those of Ctesias, a Greek who once served as a physician in the Persian court, known for his dramatic yet unreliable records. This chapter will maintain the utmost honest tension between those dramatic narratives and the possible historical realities that may lie behind them. The harem system of the Achaemenid Empire was a structural component of imperial politics, rather than merely a private domain. The queen, along with the emperor's other wives and concubines, wielded far greater influence in the political operations of the empire than what was superficially apparent. The queen managed her own lands and income, operated an independent administration, could directly submit requests to the emperor, and even accompanied military campaigns in certain instances. This system left concrete traces in historical sources beyond Herodotus, including administrative archives and Babylonian documents. Understanding this institution is a prerequisite for comprehending the internal power dynamics of Xerxes' court. It was not merely a private sphere driven by gender and emotion, but a sophisticated political arena with its own rules, strategies, and structures of interest. Reducing the harem to a space of desire is a cultural misinterpretation from a Greek perspective, which obscures the true political logic of the system and the actual political agency possessed by the women living within it. Xerxes' queen was Amestris, a woman known in Herodotus' accounts for her toughness and cruelty. Herodotus recounts a famous story about her. During his expedition to Greece, Xerxes became infatuated with the wife of his brother Mecistes, and later with her daughter Artinte, whom he married to his son Darius. When Amestris learned of this, she demanded that Mecistes' wife be handed over to her, subjecting the woman to brutal punishment. Xerxes, under pressure, agreed to this demand. This story is one of Herodotus' most dramatic narratives about the Persian court. The courtly world it portrays is filled with erotic entanglements and female political maneuvering, almost entirely disconnected from the religiously solemn image of the emperor presented in the Persepolis inscriptions. This discrepancy is one of the core difficulties in understanding Xerxes' historical persona. The same individual appears in different historical sources in ways that are nearly impossible to reconcile. This is not a failure of historical narrative, but a true reflection of historical complexity. Historical note: the accounts of Ctesias and Herodotus regarding the romantic affairs of Xerxes' court have long been one of the most challenging historical puzzles for historians. These narratives are extremely vivid, yet almost impossible to verify or refute from an archaeological or administrative document perspective. They may be partially true, perhaps a literary treatment of court rumors, or perhaps a narrative construction by Herodotus, serving his theme of corruption in the Persian court. This film presents these stories with the tone of according to Herodotus and explicitly marks their historical uncertainty. Amestris, regardless of how cautiously Herodotus's specific accounts must be approached, appears independently in Persian administrative documents. She owned land and assets in her own name, and her sons play significant roles in imperial politics. After the death of Xerxes, she remained a politically influential figure during the reign of Darius II, and in some accounts she was even described as the behind-the-scenes manipulator of actual power. This Amestris, emerging from administrative documents, is the same person as the queen depicted by Herodotus, who acted solely out of jealousy and cruelty, but clearly a more complex and politically active individual, not merely an emotionally driven court figure. Women in history, recorded in a world written by men, are often portrayed in a distorted manner. Herodotus's Amestris is driven by emotion and jealousy. In administrative archives, she is an actor with independent assets and political influence. Both may represent certain dimensions of truth. Historical figures can never be fully captured by any single type of historical source. Another core dimension of court politics is the issue of succession. Xerxes had multiple sons, and the uncertainty surrounding the inheritance of the throne was one of the sources of tension within the court from the very beginning. His sons, Darius, Artaxerxes, and Hystaspes, each had their own maternal backgrounds and court supporters, representing different interest groups. This multi-son succession structure was a systemic weakness of the Achaemenid Empire, as we have already seen in the case of Xerxes' own succession in Chapter 1. Among his sons, this weakness would manifest in a more violent manner. The night of Xerxes' death would mark the ultimate eruption of this flaw, the seeds of which had been quietly growing within the court every year of his reign. When there is no single clear rule of succession, the transfer of the imperial throne is never merely a natural transition from father to son, but a political maneuver that must be executed at the right time and in the right manner, each time carrying the potential for things to spiral out of control. After Salamis, Xerxes spent the long latter part of his reign in Persepolis and Susa. This period is largely a blank in Herodotus's narrative. His Hellenocentric perspective shows little interest in the later years of an emperor who no longer directly engaged militarily with Greece. Thus, we rely mainly on two sources to reconstruct this era. First, the administrative archives of Persepolis, which continuously recorded the daily operations of the empire. And second, Ctesias's Persica, filled with court gossip, tales of palace intrigue, poisonings, and lust, though its historical reliability is heavily questioned by scholars. Between these two sources, the post-Salamis Xerxes we can piece together remains a vague outline rather than a clear image. This vagueness is a condition that honest historical research must acknowledge. It should not be filled with fictional details, nor concealed by narrative tidiness. But presented as it is, our knowledge of the last 15 years of his life is far less than our understanding of his expedition to Greece. And that asymmetry itself is a clear signal of how historical memory operates. Ctesias deserves a separate introduction because his presence in the narrative of Xerxes' court is unavoidable. He was a Greek physician from Cnidus, said to have served as a court physician in the Persian court in the late 5th century BCE, attending to Darius II and Artaxerxes II. He authored a Fey history of Persia, Fey of which only fragments survive, transmitted to us through later excerptors. His accounts are filled with court intrigues, secrets, and dramatic episodes. But historians throughout the ages have consistently held a low opinion of their reliability. His chronology is often flawed. His details sometimes directly contradict more reliable sources. And his preference for dramatic content makes his records more akin to a collection of court legends than serious historiography. Nevertheless, his writings are our only detailed source on the inner workings of the Persian court during that period. This is the historiographical dilemma in studying the later years of Xerxes. The documentary applies the same principles to Ctesias as it does to Herodotus, treating his accounts as clues to historical possibilities rather than confirmations of historical facts, clearly indicating the source and historical uncertainty when presenting any specific story, and maintaining a narrative tension between drama and honesty without sacrificing either. This principle also applies to the darkest court story we will soon address: the death of Xerxes and the narrative of court intrigue and succession struggles behind it. That narrative will unfold in the latter part of this chapter, but its premise lies in understanding the state of historical sources for that period. This approach of establishing an epistemological framework before delving into narrative content may feel slow to some viewers, but it directly reflects the documentary's commitment to historical honesty. A dramatic narrative without methodological awareness might be more entertaining, but in terms of historical understanding, it produces illusion rather than insight. In the court narratives of Ctesias, a recurring theme emerges: stories of how Xerxes dealt with the deepening court crises in the later years of his reign. The fall from grace of officials, suspicions among family members, and the persistent unrest at the empire's frontiers, regardless of the credibility of their specific details. These stories reveal a structural truth about the exercise of absolute power. An emperor who holds such power as his reign lengthens often falls into an increasingly profound crisis of trust, because everyone around him has reason to demonstrate loyalty rather than truth. This crisis of trust does not require any specific act of betrayal to trigger it. It is a chronic erosion inherent in the very structure of absolute power. The greater the power, the narrower the channels to the truth. This is the deep contradiction of absolute power. It grants its holder the ability to alter almost all external conditions. Yet, it cannot change the fundamental distortion in the transmission of information. The emperor cannot command his subjects to cease their performances. He can only attempt, with increasing sophistication, to penetrate that performance, and such attempts often generate more suspicion, thereby deepening the isolation. In Herodotus's account, Xerxes' brother Mecystes is deeply entangled with a courtly tale concerning Amestris. According to Herodotus, after Amestris inflicted a brutal punishment on Mecystes' wife, Mecystes fled in anger, attempting to incite a rebellion in Bactria, only to be pursued and killed by troops dispatched by Xerxes. This story, if it holds any degree of truth, reveals a genuine tension in the relationships among members of the Achaemenid royal family. Royal brothers were both the most trusted pillars of governance and the most dangerous potential rivals. This duality of royal relations existed in its sharpest form within the Achaemenid system, which lacked a single clear rule of succession. In times of political stability, royal brothers were the most reliable candidates for satraps. In unstable periods, they could become the most uncontrollable centrifugal forces. The story of Mecystes, regardless of the veracity of its details, presents one of the most extreme outcomes of this structural tension. After Salamis, Xerxes' empire did not fundamentally contract. He still ruled over a vast territory stretching from Egypt to India, maintained a Persian military presence in Egypt and Asia Minor, and governed the provinces through the satrap system. However, in the later years of his reign, the empire's operations began to show signs of stress that required attention. Several provincial rebellions necessitated military intervention. Conflicts of interest among satraps required the emperor's arbitration, and a subtle shift in the empire's focus from active expansion to maintaining the status quo, faintly visible in administrative records, This was not a collapse, but rather a process of an empire reorienting itself after a significant setback. A process that has always been lengthy and inconspicuous in history. It does not produce dramatic turning points or iconic historical moments, but instead, gradually and pervasively alters the internal climate of the empire. For this reason, it is often overlooked in historical narratives or reduced to a simple phrase, decline. When examining the later years of Xerxes' reign, a historical perspective more significant than the dramatic narratives of the court emerges. The inertia of the imperial system within a sophisticated administrative apparatus that had operated for decades. Even as the personal condition of the emperor at the highest level changed, the entire system could continue to function for a considerable time, sustained by the inertia of its institutions. Couriers still delivered messages, satraps still collected taxes, artisans still received their rations, and caravans still traveled along the imperial highways. This institutional operation did not rely on the emperor's personal brilliance or diligence, but on the self-sustaining capacity of the administrative machinery established by Darius and inherited by Xerxes. In this sense, the empire in Xerxes' later years was a continuous display of Darius's legacy, rather than a direct reflection of Xerxes' personal abilities. This distinction is crucial for historical evaluation. When we say an emperor successfully maintained the empire, we must ask whether that maintenance was the product of his personal capabilities or the resilience of the institutions he inherited. In the case of Xerxes, the answer is likely both, and the two cannot be precisely separated. The physical space of the court is also a crucial dimension in the operation of power. The palace complex at Persepolis was meticulously designed with a strict hierarchy in its spatial layout, who could access which spaces, which ceremonies were held in which locations, and how the emperor appeared on various occasions. All were carefully orchestrated procedures for the display of power. The ration distributions recorded in the administrative archives of Persepolis suggest the presence of hundreds of diverse personnel within the court. Translators, scribes, guards, musicians, chefs, artisans. This formed a complete human ecosystem revolving around the emperor, where each individual occupied a precise position and maintained a calculated distance from the center of power in a meticulously defined manner. The intricacy of this ecosystem itself served as a demonstration of power. Only an empire with sufficient resources and organizational capacity could sustain court operations on such a scale, and with such precision. The emperor, as the gravitational center of this entire system, ensured its rotation around his axis through his very presence. What did this court ecosystem mean to Xerxes personally? Imagine it from one man's perspective: daily life filled with rituals, political discussions, audiences, and religious activities. Everyone who approached him came with some need and some performance. Every decision he made echoed across the entire empire. This existence was an extreme form of social loneliness, surrounded by thousands, yet unable to form any genuine relationship with most of them that wasn't distorted by the power structure. The stories in Herodotus about affairs in Xerxes' court, regardless of their historical accuracy, may touch upon a real psychological reality. In that extreme loneliness of power, any genuine flow of emotion would be systematically amplified and produce political consequences in a systematic way. This might be a reasonable way to understand Herodotus' court stories, not as sensational gossip, but as metaphorical narratives about emotional needs in an extreme power situation. The loneliness was real. The desire for genuine connection was real. And when that desire encountered the structural distortions of power, dramatic consequences were almost inevitable. In 465 BC, Xerxes was killed in a palace coup. This marked the first power transition in Achaemenid history, achieved through an assassination within the palace. And it was the moment when the long-sown seeds of structural weaknesses in the succession system bore fruit in the most violent manner, according to Ctesias, again, with the caveat of historical uncertainty. The mastermind was a high-ranking court official named Artabanus, who persuaded Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes, that the eldest son, Darius, had murdered their father, leading Artaxerxes to kill Darius. Artabanus was later discovered and executed by Artaxerxes when he attempted to seize further power. This narrative, filled with the dramatic structure of court intrigue, is of questionable credibility, but the basic fact that Xerxes was assassinated in 465 BC is widely accepted. His death was a watershed in Achaemenid history before him. Power had never been transferred through palace assassination. After him, palace coups became a common method of royal succession. The destructive precedent set by this event continued to manifest in deferred ways throughout the remainder of Achaemenid history. Xerxes died in a court where he was born, grew up, and ruled for 20 years. He died by a blade from within, not from war without. This outcome, in a sense, was an inevitable expression of the inherent logic of the Achaemenid succession system. The absence of a single clear rule of inheritance meant that every transfer of the imperial throne carried the potential for renewed contention, and when the emperor's own life became a variable in that contention, the struggle was pushed to its extreme in the most direct manner. He ruled for 20 years, built the Hall of 100 Columns, crossed the Hellespont, encountered the geographical and strategic limits of imperial power at Salamis, and then, in the darkness of the court at Persepolis, encountered another kind of boundary, the threat from those closest to him, which power could not guard against. External boundaries could be challenged with armies and engineering. Internal boundaries had no force that could be effectively deployed to protect them. This contrast is one of the most profound historical metaphors in the arc of his life. The next chapter, which also serves as a transitional section from narrative to evaluation in the entire documentary, will address the following questions. What did Xerxes leave behind? What did his death signify in the long-term history of the Achaemenid Empire? How would his successor, Artaxerxes, rule under the weight of his legacy and his shadow? And ultimately, how should we evaluate this man, not by the standards of Greek moral narratives, nor by the criteria of his own inscriptions, but through a historical understanding that strives to find the true density between the two? These questions will be confronted one by one in Chapter 8. Before entering the evaluation, the final impression this chapter aims to leave is the darkness of that court night itself. A man who spent 20 years at the center of power in the world's largest empire ultimately did not die at the hands of his most formidable enemies, but within the space where he should have been most protected. The interior of power is its own deepest vulnerability. This truth will find its rightful place in the historical evaluation of Chapter 8. Xerxes died in 465 BC at around 50 years of age, having ruled for nearly 21 years. His successor, Artaxerxes I, stabilized the situation after a bloody palace coup and continued to rule for over 40 years, ushering the Achaemenid Empire into another relatively stable period. Xerxes' death did not lead to the immediate collapse of the empire. His legacy endured in a manner more lasting than any individual life, continuing through the history that followed. However, in Western historical narratives, his name has almost become synonymous with a certain negative archetype: the arrogant Eastern tyrant, the conqueror punished by fate, the emperor who lost the empire's glory at Salamis. The 8th chapter of this documentary aims to do only one thing: behind the name shrouded in layers of historical narrative, to reconstruct, as much as possible, an evaluative framework closer to historical truth. This is not to defend him nor to overturn his case, but to clarify by what standards should we evaluate this person. The first issue to clarify is whether the defeat at Salamis equates to the failure of Xerxes' reign. This equation is almost taken for granted in Western historical narratives. But it cannot withstand serious historical scrutiny. The loss of a single battle does not automatically signify the failure of a reign. The failure to achieve a military conquest objective does not automatically equate to the collapse of an entire imperial policy. During Xerxes' 21-year rule, the Achaemenid Empire maintained complete control over its core territories, without any major collapse leading to a substantial contraction of its domain. The empire's administrative system continued to function, and the political legitimacy of the royal family remained recognized by the provinces, defining the overall success or failure of a 21-year reign. Based solely on the Battle of Salamis is a common narrative simplification in historical evaluation. And any serious historical judgment must resist the temptation of such simplification. Throughout history, countless rulers have suffered significant failures during their long reigns yet are still regarded as valuable rulers by history. Because failure is only one part of their historical legacy, not the entirety of it. This fundamental logic should apply equally when evaluating Xerxes. The second issue that needs clarification is how significant a strategic loss was the failure of the Greek campaign. From the perspective of the Persian Empire's territorial expanse, the Greek peninsula was never a core interest of the empire. It was an extended objective on the empire's western frontier, whose conquest would have brought prestige and strategic depth. But its failure did not undermine the empire's core structure. The Greek city states in Asia Minor east of the Aegean Sea remained within Persia's sphere of influence thereafter. Persia's political influence in the Aegean region did not immediately vanish after Salamis, but persisted in a more indirect manner. The failure of the Greek campaign was a significant loss of prestige and the costly failure of a strategic gamble. However, it was not a failure that threatened the empire's survival, but rather a setback to its expansionist ambitions. This distinction is crucial for accurately assessing Xerxes' historical standing. A standard that equates failed expansion with failed rule would imply that almost all imperial rulers in history would be defined as failures after encountering obstacles to expansion at some point. This standard itself is worthy of questioning. The third issue that needs clarification is what historical evaluation does Xerxes occupy compared to his father, Darius? Darius is often portrayed much more positively than Xerxes in Western historical narratives. He is described as a shrewd administrative reformer and a rational ruler who established the empire's administrative system, despite his defeat at Marathon. This comparison is, to some extent, fair. Darius's achievements in institutional development were indeed more systematic. However, it also obscures Xerxes' genuine contributions to architecture and ceremonial construction. The deeper issue is that successors rarely replicate the historical status of founders. Everything the founder does is unprecedented and inherently historically significant. Even if a successor makes equally important contributions, they are always diluted by the shadow of their predecessor. Xerxes is a typical victim of this structural bias. His achievements are invariably measured against the backdrop of his father's accomplishments. The fourth issue to clarify: what role does the construction of Persepolis play in Xerxes' historical legacy? The Hall of 100 Columns, the Gate of All Nations, and the other structures he left behind at Persepolis are genuine achievements in the architectural history of the ancient world, unparalleled in their scale, precision, and depth of artistic integration for their time. These buildings have endured for the next 2,500 years in the form of ruins, becoming one of Iran's most significant cultural sites today, attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors from around the world each year. If we measure a ruler's historical impact by their architectural legacy, Xerxes' achievements are indisputable. Those stones carry his presence more enduringly than any memory of military conquest. Alexander the Great's conquests were more spectacular militarily, but the tangible architectural remains he left behind pale in comparison to what Xerxes left at Persepolis. Historical legacies are sometimes distributed in the most unexpected ways. The stones of the defeated stand longer than the banners of the victors. The fifth issue that needs clarification is, what impact did Xerxes' rule have on the long-term fate of the Achaemenid Empire? This is a more challenging question to answer, as it requires us to consider causality on an extremely long timescale. One historical interpretation suggests that Xerxes' handling of Babylon, his excessive control over Egypt, and the inward shift of the empire's strategic focus after the failure at Salamis collectively initiated a long-term trend of decline from prosperity to downfall. This trend ultimately culminated in the complete collapse of the empire, with the arrival of Alexander the Great 150 years later. This interpretation has its logical validity in historical reasoning. But it also faces a common methodological pitfall in historical research, inferring causes from outcomes, projecting the endpoint of a prolonged historical process back onto the actions of an early figure, and attributing to that figure a historical insight that they neither possessed nor could have possessed at that time. No individual, no matter how intelligent or foresighted, can perceive the endpoint 150 years ahead from their own historical moment. When Xerxes made each of his decisions, he saw only the information available to him at that time, and faced the threats and opportunities he could perceive in the present. Judging his short-term decisions based on long-term consequences he could not foresee is an extremely unfair standard for historical actors. If we consistently apply this standard to all rulers in history, almost none would withstand such scrutiny. Fair historical evaluation requires placing the actor back in their era, assessing their choices based on the information and constraints they had, rather than conducting a retrospective reckoning from the omniscient perspective of later generations. This methodological principle is not meant to absolve any historical actor of responsibility, but to ensure the accuracy of criticism. Criticizing choices an actor could genuinely be held accountable for holds far greater historical value and moral significance than criticizing consequences they could not have foreseen. Using this fairer standard to reassess Xerxes, what do we see a ruler who, after inheriting a well-functioning empire, successfully maintained its core stability and added the most monumental architectural achievements to it? A manager who, when faced with internal rebellions within the empire, could swiftly and effectively organize suppression, preventing local uprisings from escalating into systemic collapse. A strategist who pushed the empire's military mobilization capabilities to the absolute limits of the ancient world, even if that campaign ultimately fell short of its goal. An emperor who understood his mission through religious devotion and cosmic order. The depth of his faith clearly etched into historical inscriptions. These achievements, overshadowed by the failure at Salamis, are real. Failure offers stronger narrative tension and a clearer moral framework than success, which is why Salamis dominates Xerxes' historical image. But narrative dominance does not equate to the completeness of historical truth. However, a fair historical evaluation also means not shying away from genuine criticism. Xerxes' policies in Babylon represented a choice between short-term efficiency and long-term stability, one that is justifiably questionable. His approach to controlling Egypt deviated from the cultural flexibility tradition established by his father, leading to tangible centrifugal consequences in the long run. His Greek campaign, at an immense cost to the empire's resources, resulted in a comprehensive failure of strategic objectives. His decision to lead the campaign personally tied personal glory to strategic risk, making the narrative cost of failure far exceed its military significance. These criticisms are grounded in historical evidence and should not be obscured by the impulse to defend. A truly fair historical evaluation does not selectively highlight achievements or failures, but presents both simultaneously. Honestly weighing their respective historical significance, criticism must be based on concrete historical grounds, not merely using failure as the sole reason for critique. Defense must confront genuine negative evidence, not turn into an alternative narrative. Maintaining the tension between these two is the most challenging, yet most valuable, aspect of historical evaluation. Xerxes is almost entirely unfamiliar within the context of Chinese history, and the Chinese-speaking audience of this documentary approaches him without the preconceived notions shaped by Western historical narrative traditions. This presents a rare epistemological opportunity to rediscover a figure defined by the historical accounts of his adversaries, free from the interference of established narrative frameworks. This sense of unfamiliarity is not a barrier, but a gift. It allows us to engage with Xerxes in a manner closer to the historical materials themselves, rather than through Herodotus' narrative filter or the visual imagination of Hollywood films. In a sense, this documentary is rewriting a segment of history for the Chinese-speaking audience, one unburdened by historical baggage. Such an unencumbered reading may yield a historical understanding less constrained by preconceptions than that of Western academia. This is not to say that Chinese-speaking viewers are more objective, but rather that any historical narrative tradition, when in operation long enough, develops inertia and blind spots. Readers from different traditions, precisely because of their unfamiliarity, may more easily discern the contours of those blind spots. This cross-cultural reading of history is one of the most valuable intellectual endeavors in the field of historiography. To evaluate a historical figure, one must also ask, what did his era require, and to what extent did he meet that need? At the moment, Xerxes inherited the Achaemenid Empire. What was needed was stability, the continuation of legitimacy, and the ability to establish his own historical standing under the shadow of his father. His rule largely achieved the first 2 points. For the third, he chose to build his historical legacy through grand military conquests, a choice that was strategically understandable but costly in its outcomes. Yet, leaders of any era face similar structural pressures: how to balance the role of successor with that of a historical agent, and how to navigate between preserving existing achievements and creating new historical contributions. Xerxes' choice within this universal framework is not an anomaly, but a typical expression of the psychology of human power. Every successor who begins their rule under the immense shadow of a predecessor faces the psychological pressure to prove they are more than just a caretaker. That pressure is a deep-seated driver in humanity's relationship with power and history. The desire to leave one's own mark, not merely to preserve the marks left by others. Artaxerxes I, the successor of Xerxes, ruled for over 40 years from his father's legacy, and is widely regarded by historians as a steady ruler. This in itself serves as indirect evidence of Xerxes' legacy. An empire that, after enduring palace coups, defeats in the Greek campaigns, and a succession crisis, could swiftly regain stability and continue to function effectively under the next emperor demonstrates that the imperial system inherited and maintained by Xerxes possessed sufficient institutional resilience. That resilience was not solely the legacy of Darius, but also remained fundamentally intact during Xerxes' reign. Though it faced pressure and left behind cracks, it did not break. This fact represents an often underestimated dimension in historical evaluation. If a ruler successfully passes on the institutions he inherited intact to his successor, that act of transmission itself constitutes a historical contribution that cannot be overlooked, even if the institutions were not further deepened under his rule. This documentary, when addressing historical evaluation, consistently adheres to one principle. Historical figures are not vessels for moral allegories, but products of their times, as well as forces that shaped those times. Xerxes was both a product of the Achaemenid Empire at that specific historical moment, inheriting its power structures, religious beliefs, and understanding of imperial expansion, and an actor who, within those constraints, made a series of specific choices in his own way. Evaluating him requires acknowledging both dimensions, the power of structure and the agency of the individual. The most meaningful place for historical evaluation lies at the intersection of these two: pure structural determinism, where everything is a product of the era and institutions, rendering individuals insignificant, and pure great man theory, where everything stems from the will of exceptional individuals, are overly simplistic models of historical understanding. The truth of history exists between the two. Structures shape the realm of possibilities for actors, and within that space, the specific choices of actors still produce tangible historical differences. The image of Xerxes in the Greek narrative tradition presents a thought-provoking contrast to his portrayal in modern Iranian historical memory. In Western historical narratives, he is depicted as an arrogant failure. In contrast, within Iran's historical and cultural identity, Persepolis and the Achaemenid Empire stand as core symbols of national heritage, and Xerxes, as part of that legacy, carries cultural meanings entirely distinct from those in Western accounts. This contrast reveals a universal truth about historical memory. The same historical figure can bear almost entirely different symbolic meanings across different civilizational memory systems, and no single tradition of memory can claim to hold the sole historical truth. Understanding this is not only significant for interpreting Xerxes, but serves as a fundamental premise for comprehending all cross-civilizational historical narratives, particularly at historical junctures where Eastern and Western civilizations intersect, where this insight is especially crucial. Historical evaluation is ultimately an act of choosing a framework of values. If we judge Xerxes by the success or failure of his military conquests, he was a loser. If we evaluate him based on the maintenance of imperial stability, he was a passable administrator. If we assess him through his architectural legacy, he was a genuine achiever. If we consider his contribution to the historical narrative tradition, whether positive or negative, he stands as one of the most influential symbolic figures of the ancient world, remaining a central character in films, literature, and historical debates even 2.5 millennia later. Any single criterion of evaluation is insufficient. The true challenge of the art of historical evaluation lies in seeking an honest synthesis among multiple standards. This challenge has no definitive correct answer, only attempts that are more or less honest. The 8th chapter of this documentary is one such attempt, not to affix any final label to Xerxes, but to reveal the complexity of evaluation itself and to invite viewers to form their own judgments within that complexity. Salamis, that deepest scar etched into the memory of history, must be restored to its rightful place as this documentary draws to a close. It was not the defining moment of Xerxes' entire life and reign, though it has played that role in Herodotus' narrative and in the Western historical imagination for the past 2.5 millennia. It was the most dramatic moment of his rule, the moment with the greatest narrative energy, and the one that gained dominance in the contest over the narrative of his historical legacy. Yet, gaining dominance does not equate to monopolizing historical truth. Beyond Salamis lies Persepolis, beyond the Greek narrative. There are inscriptions and archives, beyond the image of the defeated. There is the man who sat on his throne in tears, sensing the fleeting nature of human destiny a century later. The integrity of historical figures never resides in any single narrative source, but in the sum and tension of all sources. That sum is where we come as close as possible to historical truth. Chapter 8 serves as the evaluation chapter of this documentary. After 7 chapters of narrative, from the birth of Xerxes to his death, from the construction of Persepolis to the defeat at Salamis, and from the dominance of Greek narratives to the re-emergence of Persian voices, this chapter aims to place these narrative materials within a broader framework of historical evaluation. It seeks to clarify who this man truly was, what he actually accomplished, and the real historical impact of his actions. Chapter 9 will adopt a more macro perspective. What does this war, this clash of civilizations, signify in the grander historical landscape? What long-term effects did it have on Greece, Persia, and the subsequent civilizations of the Mediterranean? These are the historical depths that this documentary ultimately seeks to explore. A war, regardless of its outcome, does not belong solely to the era in which it occurred. Its influence permeates subsequent history in various ways, reshaping political landscapes, cultural self-perceptions, and the way civilizations understand one another. The Greco-Persian Wars, as the first large-scale military clash between Eastern and Western civilizations, created historical ripples that have yet to fully subside even today. At the end of this chapter, let us return to that initial question, failure or builder. The answer, after experiencing the 8 chapters of this documentary, should be clear: he is both. Simultaneously, across different dimensions, and with varying historical depths. His failures are real, costly, and cannot be erased from the narrative. His constructions are equally real, written in stone and institutions, still standing 2.5 millennia later. The complexity of a historical figure lies in their ability to embody seemingly contradictory things at once. The historical legacy of Xerxes is one of the clearest demonstrations of this complexity. And understanding that complexity is the central invitation of this documentary from start to finish. A person, if their life is rich enough, filled with enough contradictions, and deeply embedded in all the tensions of their era, deserves to be understood seriously, not merely labeled and filed away in some historical cabinet. Xerxes, by this standard, is worthy of serious understanding. 2,500 years later, he still deserves for us to pause and reflect upon his name. A war ends, but history does not stop. After the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, the Persian army withdrew from the Greek peninsula and the Greco-Persian Wars came to a military conclusion. However, the true historical impact of this war was only beginning to emerge at that moment of military resolution. The significance of a war is never confined to its immediate military outcomes. Who won, who lost, how territories were divided, but lies in how it reshaped the political structures, cultural self-perceptions of the parties involved, and their relationships with one another within the broader historical process. The Greco-Persian Wars, as the first large-scale military clash between Eastern and Western civilizations in ancient history, produced ripples that continue to resonate even today. This chapter, the most expansive in scope in this documentary, seeks to trace those ripples across both space and time, striving to understand as fully as possible what this war truly changed. Influence is one of the most challenging aspects of historical study, as it requires us to isolate the independent contribution of a single event or decision within a complex web of causality, amidst a multitude of intertwined variables. This isolation is always incomplete. Yet, attempting it is an essential process for grasping the depth of history. For the Greek city-states, the most immediate political consequence of this war was the rise of Athens. Salamis was a naval victory for Athens, and this naval triumph granted Athens an indisputable new status within the Greek city-state system. After the war, with the Delian League at its core, Athens swiftly transformed a defensive alliance into an imperial political structure centered around itself. the Allied states paid tribute to the common treasury, which was essentially protection money to Athens. With this wealth, Athens built the Parthenon, constructed the long walls, and laid all the material foundations for the glory of the Periclean age. Thus, the Greco-Persian Wars were not merely a defensive struggle against an external threat. They also served as fuel for Athenian imperialism. The successful resistance against an external threat was transformed into the suppression of power over internal allies. This transformation has been repeated throughout history. The strength forged in the face of external danger, once the threat is removed, often seeks new purposes, and the most convenient purpose is often the domination of weaker internal members. Victory is never a neutral historical event. It always opens up certain historical possibilities while closing others. Sparta, another key participant in this war, inherited a historical legacy from the Greco-Persian Wars entirely different from that of Athens. Its land-based contributions at Thermopylae and Plataea preserved its status as the leader of the Greek army. Yet the naval battle of Salamis established Athenian maritime supremacy, with sea power growing, increasingly vital in subsequent Mediterranean politics. This asymmetry between Sparta and Athens was one of the underlying causes of the Peloponnesian War. The rise of Athens was ultimately perceived by Sparta as an existential threat. While the Greco-Persian Wars defeated Persia, they simultaneously sowed the seeds for a 3-decade-long civil war among the Greek city-states, a profound irony of history and a clear demonstration of how power fills a vacuum. The removal of an external threat did not bring peace, but instead unleashed the pressures of internal competition. In a sense, the presence of Persia had always been a structural condition maintaining the limited unity of the Greek city-states. As this condition weakened, the centrifugal forces within the Greek city-state system returned to their historical norm at their natural pace. What did the world mean for the Persian Empire after this war? A question that needs to be answered, honestly, is, did the defeat in the Greco-Persian Wars truly alter the historical trajectory of the Persian Empire? From direct evidence, the answer is limited. The empire's core territory remained unchanged. Its administrative system did not collapse, and its economic foundation remained intact. However, from a longer-term perspective, some historians argue that the failure in the Greek campaigns initiated a trend of strategic contraction. In the subsequent history of the Persian Empire, diplomatic and financial means were increasingly employed to influence Greek affairs rather than direct military intervention. This shift can be interpreted as a mature strategic adaptation or as a passive retrenchment following the depletion of strength. The tension between these two interpretations remains an unresolved issue in historical research to this day. This tension itself serves as an important reminder in historical judgment. When two historically grounded interpretations cannot be entirely dismissed, it may suggest that historical reality inherently contains a blend of both possibilities, and our impulse to seek a single correct answer is itself a simplification of historical complexity. Acknowledging this tension and honestly maintaining a suspension between the two interpretations is the most valuable stance for historical research when faced with insufficient evidence. The most profound historical impact of the Greco-Persian Wars may not lie in the direct changes it brought to political landscapes, but rather in how it shaped the self-narrative of Western civilization. The narrative framework constructed by Athens after the war, democracy versus autocracy, reason versus ignorance, freedom versus enslavement, has been replicated, expanded, and grafted onto entirely different historical contexts over the following 2,500 years. From Rome's narrative of Eastern barbarians to the medieval Christian world's narrative of the Islamic world. From the civilizational hierarchy of modern European colonialism to the ideological opposition of the 20th century Cold War. The shadow of this framework repeatedly emerges in historical scenes that appear unrelated to Greece. This is the most enduring and cautionary legacy of the Greco-Persian Wars. When a narrative framework is invoked by enough people over a sufficiently long period, it gradually transforms from an explanatory tool into a self-evident premise of a worldview. It no longer requires justification, because it has become the starting point of argumentation. The solidification of such narrative frameworks is one of the phenomena that historical research must remain most vigilant about, as it blinds us to the historical complexities obscured by the framework. The danger of this narrative framework lies not in its complete falsehood, but in its partial truth being overapplied. There were indeed genuine differences in political systems between the Greek city-states and the Persian Empire, and there were legitimate political philosophical disagreements between democratic deliberation and monarchical autocracy. The problem arises when these localized, real differences are elevated into a universal framework of civilizational opposition and used to explain all historical East-West relations, producing distortion rather than clarity. Historically, the East and the West have never been two internally homogeneous, mutually opposing civilizational units. They are complex assemblages of countless overlapping and mutually influencing cultural and political entities. Any narrative that reduces this complexity to a single axis of opposition generates misunderstanding. This judgment is not a product of relativism. It is not to say that all historical narratives are equally valid, or that all political systems are equally commendable. It simply states, simplification is a necessary tool of narrative, but when it crosses a certain threshold and becomes a systematic obscuration of complex reality, it transforms from a tool of understanding into an obstacle. To understanding identifying where that threshold lies is one of the core skills of historical reading. The impact of the Peloponnesian War on Greek culture itself stands as one of the most direct and well-documented historical consequences of the conflict. The cultural flourishing of Athens in the post-war period, marked by tragedy, philosophy, architecture, and the deepening of democracy, is widely regarded by historians as closely linked to the psychological and political aftermath of this victory. The triumph in the war instilled in Athenian citizens a profound confidence in the legitimacy of their cultural model. And this confidence unleashed a wave of cultural creativity. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Pericles, Socrates, the Parthenon. These names and structures emerged in the century following the end of the Peloponnesian War. Historical golden ages often have specific historical preconditions, and one of the preconditions for Athens' golden age was precisely the war that nearly led to its conquest by Persia. This connection suggests a historical pattern regarding the relationship between creativity and crisis. Extreme pressure can sometimes unleash extraordinary creativity, as it shatters existing psychological equilibrium and compels people to understand themselves and the world in entirely new ways. The sense of existential threat that Athens accumulated under the Persian menace may well be one of the deep-seated sources of the intense cultural creative energy that erupted in the post-war period. Yet, that golden age of Athens also had its profound shadows. It was a society built on the economic foundation of slave labor, an imperial structure that transformed tribute from allied states into its own cultural brilliance, and a democratic system that excluded women from citizenship. When we speak of Athenian democracy today, we refer to an extremely limited form of democracy. In the city hailed as the cradle of democratic institutions, those who truly possessed the right to vote were a minority among the adult population. This is not to deny the genuine achievements of that era, but to maintain a sober awareness amidst our admiration, the historical image of ancient Greek democracy that we have inherited has undergone extensive selective memory and retrospective projection of modern values. creating a significant distance from the actual historical reality of that time. This distance does not negate the historical significance of Athenian democracy, but rather urges us to remain sensitive to the historical diversity of the concept of democracy. What each era calls democracy is a product of its historical conditions and power structures, each with its practical scope and inherent mechanisms of exclusion. Understanding the true boundaries of Athenian democracy is an essential starting point for comprehending how the concept of democracy itself has evolved throughout history. The impact of the Greco-Persian Wars on Persian culture is a topic almost entirely absent from Western historical narratives. After the wars, the Persian Empire did not cease its cultural creativity. Persepolis continued to expand after Xerxes. The Achaemenid artistic tradition flourished under his successors, and Persian language, religion, and administrative culture continued to shape the history of the Middle East for centuries to come. The war, defined by the Greeks as a decisive clash of civilizations, left relatively limited traces in Persian cultural history, perhaps because, in Persia's own narrative, it was never a civilization defining conflict, but merely a setback in a frontier expedition, a localized stumble in the broader march of imperial history. This contrast serves as a remarkably clear example of narrative asymmetry. The same war can occupy vastly different historical weight in the cultural memories of different participants, and this disparity in weight precisely reveals the distinct hierarchies of values within their respective narrative systems. For the victor's narrative, defeat is absolutely central. For the vanquished's narrative, it is often just a historical episode to be digested and then moved beyond. After the war, the Greek city-state's understanding of Persian culture developed in a peculiar and contradictory manner. On one hand, the conflict deepened the Greeks' stereotypical perception of the Persians as a monolithic other. On the other hand, with the continuation of trade, diplomacy, and interpersonal exchanges, actual contact and mutual understanding between the two worlds increased rather than diminished in the post-war period. Herodotus himself, in his descriptions of the Persian Empire, exhibited both deep-seated biases and genuine curiosity. He was among the first Greek writers to attempt to understand the other through an anthropological lens. This contradiction, constructing a stereotypical image of the other while maintaining genuine curiosity about that other, is a common epistemological state when civilizations encounter one another, and it remains prevalent in today's world. In fact, stereotypes and curiosity often coexist, as stereotypes reduce the cost of understanding, while curiosity resists such simplification. The tension between the two represents the most authentic internal condition of cross-civilizational understanding and serves as the starting point that any serious cultural dialogue must honestly confront. The philosophical impact of this war is a topic worthy of separate discussion. In a sense, the Greek tragic tradition represents a cultural digestion of the psychological trauma and the joy of victory from the Greco-Persian Wars. In Fathy Persians, Aeschylus presents Xerxes' defeat and the grief of the Persians from a surprisingly humanistic perspective, one of the earliest works in ancient literature to narrate a war from the enemy's viewpoint. Amidst the atmosphere of Athenian triumph, this play does not incite hatred toward the Persians, but instead portrays the humanity of the defeated with a tone approaching sympathy. This perspective is not isolated within the Greek literary tradition. It is deeply connected to the tragic tradition's thematic focus on fate, hubris, and human limitations. Aeschylus's portrayal of Xerxes in Fathy Persians aligns in certain respects with Herodotus's moral narrative. Both treat hubris and its consequences as central themes. However, Aeschylus goes further by allowing the Persians' grief itself to take center stage, granting the defeated a human dignity, a rare achievement in literature's treatment of wartime experience. From a broader historical perspective, the Greco-Persian Wars serve as a rich source for thought experiments about what did not happen. How would history have unfolded if Persia had conquered Greece? In Western historical imagination, this hypothetical scenario is often portrayed tragically. Greek philosophy, democracy, and the very foundations of Western civilization would have been stifled by Persian despotism. Yet, this assumption itself is a product of the democracy versus tyranny narrative framework. It presupposes that Persian conquest would inevitably lead to cultural destruction rather than a new synthesis. In reality, the Achaemenid Empire did not systematically eradicate local cultures in other regions it conquered. Instead, it largely preserved and utilized them. The true answer to the question of, what if Persia had conquered Greece, is likely far more complex than the tragic hypothesis suggests. Counterfactual historical thinking is not about arriving at a definitive alternative history, but about revealing the historical contingency of what we often perceive as inevitable in the actual course of events. Athenian democracy was not predestined to exist, nor was Greek philosophy fated to develop exactly as it did. Recognizing this contingency allows us to maintain a proper historical reverence for the pivotal moments that truly altered the course of history. The Greco-Persian Wars also initiated a geopolitical rivalry between East and West that lasted for nearly 2 centuries. The intermittent conflicts and diplomacy between Persia and the Greek city-states continued until Alexander the Great launched his eastern campaign in 334 BCE. During these 2 centuries, Persia remained a significant external variable in Greek politics, sometimes appearing as a military threat, sometimes as economic aid. The famous Persian gold was used to fund Sparta against Athens during the Peloponnesian War. This complex mutual involvement repeatedly undermined the simplistic narrative of Greece versus Persia through practical actions over 2 centuries of historical practice. The logic of geopolitics is often more pragmatic and intricate than the narrative of civilizational opposition. When Sparta accepted Persian gold to fight against its former ally Athens, the gap between the grand narrative of civilization versus barbarism and actual political behavior was exposed almost beyond concealment. This gap is not a historical error, but a historical norm. Narratives hold meaning at the specific historical moment of their creation, but they cannot fully constrain subsequent political actors, who make choices based on their own calculations of interest, regardless of whether those choices align with the narrative. Alexander the Great stands as the most pivotal link in the historical chain of influence stemming from the Greco-Persian Wars. Presenting himself as Greece's avenger, he conquered the entire Persian Empire under the pretext of retaliating for Xerxes' burning of Athens, and in 330 BCE he set fire to Persepolis. This act of destruction is surrounded by highly contested historical narratives. Some ancient sources record it as an impulsive act following a drunken revelry, while others describe it as a calculated political decision, a symbolic gesture to conclude the war of vengeance against Persia. Regardless of the truth, the burning of Persepolis marks the final major chapter in the historical narrative chain of the Greco-Persian Wars. A dialogue that began 150 years earlier reached its material conclusion in this blaze. Yet history does not cease its narrative continuity merely because of a physical endpoint. After its destruction, Persepolis continued to exist in the form of ruins. The narrative legacy of the Greco-Persian Wars persisted in various forms within Western historical writings long after the fire. The end of the material is never the end of the narrative. From a broader historical perspective, perhaps the most profound impact of the Greco-Persian Wars lies in their role in shaping the very concepts of East and West. Before the wars, the distinction between Greeks and non-Greeks was primarily cultural and linguistic. After the wars, this distinction acquired political and moral dimensions. The East gradually became a symbolic concept associated with despotism, luxury, and irrationality, while the West evolved into its opposing symbol, linked to freedom, rationality, and restraint. This symbolic opposition is one of the most influential conceptual constructs in the history of human civilization, permeating political discourse, literary imagination, and historical writing for centuries in an almost ubiquitous manner. The initial material foundation of this construct was the specific narratives of the Greco-Persian Wars, compiled by Herodotus, circulated in the Athenian assembly, and performed on tragic stages. The evolution from concrete narratives to an abstract symbolic system exemplifies the operation of narrative power in civilization, and the Greco-Persian Wars stand as one of the clearest historical cases along this path. This chapter concludes with a fundamental question about historical influence. Where does it begin, and where does it end? The impact of the Greco-Persian Wars spread spatially throughout the subsequent Mediterranean civilization, and through the dissemination of European civilization, ultimately reached every corner of the world in a certain sense. Temporally, it has never truly ended. Every time someone invokes the narrative of democracy versus autocracy, every time someone sees the jewel-adorned god King Xerxes in a cinema, and every time someone discusses the foundations of Western civilization, the echoes of that war are present in one way or another, near or far. History is never a completed past, but a continuous presence. That war remains alive today. From Chapter 1 to Chapter 9, this documentary attempts not only to tell the story of an ancient emperor, but also to demonstrate, through that story, how history operates, how narratives are formed, how evidence is selected and interpreted, how influence extends across eras, and how understanding these processes enables us to maintain a more conscious and proactive critical relationship with the historical narratives we inherit. Chapter 10 is the final stop of this documentary. This documentary has reached its final chapter. Over the past 9 chapters, we have followed Xerxes from his birth to his death, from the stones of Persepolis to the waves of Salamis, from the peak of the empire to the boundaries of power. We have attempted a difficult task to seek the Persian voice obscured by the dominant narrative within historical materials, almost entirely dominated by Greek accounts, to see a more complex historical figure behind the moralized image of the Eastern tyrant, and to reassess the tangible achievements in construction and governance beyond the verdict of military defeat. This chapter no longer traces historical events, but turns to a more fundamental question when a historical figure's life has ended. What remains not just material legacies, but in the ever-shifting realm of historical memory? In what way does he continue to exist? There is no simple answer to this question. The workings of historical memory are more complex, more layered, and more contentious than any single narrative can describe. Yet, it is precisely within that complexity and contention that the most meaningful aspects of historical understanding take root. Memory, in the historical sense, is not passive preservation but active construction. Each generation reconstructs the historical figures they inherit according to the needs and language of their own era. The historical memory of Xerxes has undergone a series of constructions and reconstructions over these 2.5 millennia. A moral allegory in the Greek era, an imperial symbol in Roman times, a metaphor for Oriental despotism in modern Europe, and a silver screen myth in 20th century Hollywood. Each reconstruction is not a simple inheritance of the previous version, but a new layer, adding fresh interpretations atop the old, making that historical figure whose original appearance is already difficult to discern, grow ever thicker and more distant from the person he actually was in the specific historical moment of 519 BCE. Memory, through its accumulation, is both preservation and concealment. This duality is key to understanding the workings of historical memory. Each new interpretation preserves certain information about this figure for later generations, while also making earlier information, perhaps closer to the original historical reality, harder to see beneath the new layer. 2.5 millennia of accumulation mean that today, to access that initial historical reality, we must penetrate more layers of narrative than any other era in history could have imagined. This documentary itself is also a construction. It selects certain materials, presents them in a specific order, emphasizes particular historical judgments, and avoids others. All of these choices shape the audience's understanding of Xerxes and participate in the construction process that has spanned 2.5 millennia. The creators of this documentary cannot stand outside that process, nor do they claim the right to do so. What we can do is to be as aware as possible that we are engaging in construction and to present the basis of that construction. The sources of historical materials, the choices of methodology, and the reasoning behind judgments to the audience. This enables viewers to form their own independent judgments rather than passively accepting our narrative. This self-awareness is one of the methodological commitments of this documentary and a fundamental respect for its audience. Historical narratives are never transparent glass. They have color, thickness, and refractive indices. The color and refractive indices of this documentary leave traces throughout the 9 chapters of its narrative. In the way historical materials are presented, the phrasing of judgments, and the timing of perspective shifts. Each instance reflecting the work of construction, acknowledging this is not a sign of weakness, but of honesty. And honesty is the greatest gift a historical narrative can offer its audience. The triple legacy left by Xerxes is the core content that this documentary attempts to integrate in its epilogue. The first legacy is material. The stones of Persepolis, the reliefs, the inscriptions, and the synthesis of organizational capability and artistic imagination required to create them. This legacy is the most silent and enduring over 2.5 millennia. It requires no narrative framework to sustain its existence. It simply stands there, with its material density carrying authentic information about an era and a civilization. Today, this legacy is jointly safeguarded by modern archaeology and Iran's national cultural identity, and the historical information it carries holds the potential for new interpretations with each generation that re-examines it. This openness of material heritage is a key feature that distinguishes it from written narratives. Words can be interpreted and misinterpreted, but the density of stone, the precision of relief lines, and the arrangement of inscribed characters offer a historical presence that is far more resistant to arbitrary reinterpretation than language. Every person standing before the ruins of Persepolis is a direct recipient of that presence. The second legacy is narrative. Xerxes' image in the Western historical imagination. The arrogant Eastern tyrant, the conqueror punished by fate. The emperor who lost everything at Salamis. This legacy is the most clamorous of the three, and the most widely influential. It exists in Herodotus's writings, on Aeschylus's stage, in 20th century Hollywood films, and in the historical memory of every student who has studied Western civilization. This legacy is a constructed product, carrying the political needs and cultural biases of the historical moments that shaped it. Yet it is also a genuine historical force, because it has exerted a demonstrable influence on the historical understanding and cultural imagination of countless generations thereafter. Construction, when it is enduring and widespread enough, becomes a secondary historical reality. This is one of the most complex phenomena in historical narrative. An image initially shaped by specific political needs. After sufficient dissemination and reinterpretation, begins to carry its own historical weight, making it impossible for later generations to simply erase it, forcing them to build upon it. Xerxes' image as the arrogant loser has now acquired this quality of secondary historical reality, and any narrative effort to revise this image must confront the weight of its existence. The third legacy is one of inquiry. The story of Xerxes serves as an enduring source of historical questions. What constitutes a fair historical assessment? How do narrative frameworks form and solidify? How can the voices of the defeated be preserved in histories dominated by the victors? Where does the impulse for imperial expansion originate? And what is its relationship with religious belief? How does power, within its own structure, generate loneliness and crises of trust? These questions, anchored in the specific history of Xerxes, extend far beyond the individual himself. They are fundamental issues that humanity must repeatedly confront when dealing with power, history, and civilization. In this sense, Xerxes' most enduring legacy may be the questions his story provokes, rather than merely the answers his life left behind. A historical figure capable of continually inspiring genuine historical inquiry possesses a value that transcends the specific successes or failures of their era. Their story becomes a gateway for contemplating the human condition, a lasting case study for understanding how power, narrative, and historical memory operate. In this sense, Xerxes is an exceptionally rich case study, whose value continues to grow as historical research deepens. Historical memory possesses a gravitational pull, tending to reduce complexity into concise forms that can be remembered. Under this influence, Xerxes has been distilled into a few core images: the emperor on his throne, the arrogance of whipping the sea, and the spectator on the throne at Salamis. Each of these images has its historical origins and carries a certain degree of authentic historical information, but their sum falls far short of capturing the historical complexity of a real human being who existed in the world for about 50 years and ruled for 21. This documentary attempts to add more layers beyond those core images. Xerxes as the builder of the Hall of 100 Columns. Xerxes as the devout believer in the XPH inscription. Xerxes navigating the workings of court politics, and Xerxes shedding tears at the Hellespont while overlooking his vast army, feeling the fleeting nature of fate. These layers may not replace the core images, but they can enrich them, bringing them closer to the historical reality of that person. The image of a historical figure, when enriched, does not become more blurred, but clearer. Clarity does not come from simplification, but from the three-dimensionality that emerges when complexity is honestly presented. A historical figure, with only a single outline, is a historical puppet. One with depth and internal contradictions is a real person. This documentary seeks to make Xerxes the latter. 2,500 years is a span of time whose length is difficult to truly comprehend. From the era of Xerxes' reign to today, humanity has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the clash of civilizations, and the construction and reconstruction of narratives countless times. Throughout this vast expanse, the name of Xerxes has persisted in various forms, in the works of historians, in the debates of philosophers, on the stages of playwrights, in the measurement records of architectural historians studying the ruins of Persepolis, in the history textbooks of Iranian schools, and in the creative discussions of Hollywood visual effects teams. For a single name to be continuously mentioned, interpreted, and debated over 2.5 millennia. This in itself is a form of historical existence that transcends military victories or defeats. By the enduring presence of his name, Xerxes has, in a sense, triumphed over narratives that seek to define him merely as a failure. The existence of a name is the minimal, yet most fundamental form of historical presence. As long as a person's name is still mentioned, they remain, in some way, within the consciousness of history. The fact that Xerxes' name has never ceased to be invoked over 2,500 years is a historical status that no military outcome could ever grant or take away. A conqueror who vanishes completely from time is farther from history than a defeated figure who still lives on in historical discourse. Persepolis, today recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, stands as one of Iran's most significant archaeological sites, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors from around the world each year. The stones, erected over 2.5 millennia ago, under the orders of Xerxes, still rise from the plains of Fars province, casting long shadows under the sun. Anyone standing before these ruins engages in a direct, tangible encounter with a historical reality from 25 centuries past. This encounter offers a historical experience that no narrative can fully replicate. You stand there, sensing the scale of the stones, the intricacy of the reliefs, the immense energy of an empire at its zenith, and the ultimate relativity of that grandeur in the face of time. This relativity is not emptiness, but a reminder of the true meaning of human achievement. All greatness that once existed is finite on the scale of time. Yet that finitude does not diminish its genuine value. During its existence, the ruins of Persepolis, in their incompleteness, speak this truth. History, in its deepest sense, is the story of how humanity exists through time. Xerxes, during that specific period, existed in this world in a particular way. He constructed buildings, formulated policies, waged wars, navigated the loves and hatreds within the court, confronted the solitude of power, and, on a night we cannot precisely pinpoint, ended his life in some corner of the Persepolis palace. All of this happened, was real, and is irrevocable. History, in this sense, is a continuous witness to that irrevocability we record, narrate, and analyze to prevent what has occurred from vanishing entirely into time, to preserve a historical place for those people and events that once truly existed under the pressure of oblivion. This work is one of the oldest and most enduring tasks of human civilization. Its drive stems from an instinct to resist forgetting, from a deep-seated belief that what has happened is worth remembering. Historiography, in its deepest sense, is the organized expression of this belief. This documentary maintains a dual consciousness when dealing with the history of Xerxes. On one hand, there is respect for the specific historical figure. He is not a symbol, nor a vehicle for moral allegory, but a real human being who made a series of genuine choices under specific historical conditions. On the other hand, there is vigilance toward the narrative itself. Any narrative about him, including that of this documentary, is a construct carrying the limitations of perspective and constraints of historical sources it cannot fully escape. Maintaining tension between these two forms of consciousness is the core methodological stance of this documentary and its fundamental commitment to historical honesty. This tension has no ultimate resolution. It can only be maintained as honestly as possible, reaffirmed in every chapter and every narrative choice. Sustaining tension without rushing to resolve it reflects epistemological maturity. It signifies an acceptance of the fundamental fact that historical truth cannot be fully grasped and an ongoing effort to approach it as honestly as possible under this acceptance. That effort is the reason for this documentary's existence, and the reason for the discipline of history itself. Oblivion is the default state of history. Without any effort, historical figures vanish over time, leaving not even their names behind. Xerxes, due to the uniqueness of his position as the supreme ruler of an empire who launched a historic war against a Greek city, states survived under the pressure of oblivion. But survival does not always occur in its complete form. Xerxes survived in a highly distorted shape, creating an almost unbridgeable gap between his presence in Western historical narratives and the way he actually existed in history. This documentary, spanning 9 chapters, attempts to partially bridge that gap. Whether it succeeds is for the audience to judge, but the attempt itself is worthwhile. Every reading of history is not merely about doing something for those who have already died. It is also about doing something for those living in the present, helping them understand how historical narratives operate, helping them recognize the existing frameworks that flow silently within culture, and equipping them with a more conscious critical tool when confronting contemporary historical constructions. Understanding how Xerxes is narrated is to understand narrative itself, and understanding narrative itself makes us better readers of history. Let us approach the end of this chapter with a specific scene. In the summer of 480 BC, in northern Greece, an army of unprecedented scale was advancing southward. Among those marching in that army were soldiers from Persia, Media, Bactria, India, Egypt, Babylon, and Asia Minor, along with translators and scribes, engineers and doctors, craftsmen and cooks who followed the troops. Each person had their own name, their own hometown, their own understanding of this expedition, and their own imagination of returning home. Most of them, we do not even know their names. Their names have vanished into time, leaving no trace even in oblivion. And at the forefront of that army, there was an emperor whose name we know, Xerxes. That name, even after 2.5 millennia, can still be spoken. The names of those nameless soldiers have disappeared, not because their lives were not worth remembering, but simply because historical records, in their structural tendencies, have always been more likely to preserve the names near the centers of power, while allowing the lives farther from those centers to fade into silence. This silence is something that historiography must acknowledge in its most honest moments. That army, 2.5 millennia later, still exists in various forms, in the writings of Herodotus, in the processions of envoys from various peoples depicted on the stairway reliefs of Persepolis, in the numbers recorded in the administrative archives of Persepolis detailing rations distribution, and in the artifacts of nameless soldiers unearthed by archaeologists. Every member of that army, in their own way, left traces in history, some as names, some as numbers, some as artifacts, and some leaving nothing at all. History exists in countless densities and forms. That army is a microcosm of these countless densities and forms. Standing before this microcosm, Xerxes, with the enduring presence of his name, represents the most vividly remembered face of that era in our collective memory today. However, this documentary hopes that, after 10 chapters of narrative, that face has gained its due complexity for the audience. Not merely a face of moral allegory, not just a vehicle for narrative function, but the face of a person who once truly existed in this world, made choices in his time, and left behind his legacy. Deepening historical understanding requires time, sustained engagement from different perspectives, and a willingness to embrace the initial discomfort that arises when existing knowledge is challenged, and then to move beyond that discomfort. This documentary, through the story of Xerxes as a specific figure, practices this very process. We confront our preconceived notions about him, then engage with materials that contradict those notions, and within the discomfort between the two, seek a more nuanced understanding that approaches the true complexity of history. This practice lies at the heart of historical inquiry, not just concerning Xerxes, but all historical figures and events we assume we already know. True historical understanding is always a work in progress. It is not a destination, but an ongoing journey. This process does not end with the conclusion of a documentary, the closing of a book, or the completion of a course. It ceases only in one scenario, when we decide we have learned enough and no longer need to engage with materials that challenge our existing understanding. That decision is the greatest enemy of historical comprehension. The willingness to continue engaging and to remain open to revision is the most fundamental epistemological virtue of history. Xerxes Xerxes. In Persian, it means hero among heroes, or ruler of heroes. That name, chosen by his parents 2,500 years ago, has been recorded, spread, interpreted, forgotten, and rediscovered in countless ways over the following 25 centuries. Today, it is mentioned once again in this documentary at this very moment as you read or hear these words. History, in its own unique way, is happening right now. A voice from 2,500 years ago. Through those stones, those inscriptions, the words of Herodotus, the ruins of Persepolis, traverses time and reaches you. What that voice says, perhaps only you, in this specific moment of reading or viewing, can provide the final answer. History, ultimately, is completed in the listener. This is not to say that history lacks objective facts. Those events, those decisions, those inscriptions and archives possess a historical existence, independent of any narrative. But their meaning, their relevance today, the understanding and questions they inspire, these are completed in every person who encounters them, in every genuine moment of historical contact. Xerxes, at the end of this documentary, returns once more to that place, awaiting the next reading, the next reflection, the next revision, the next step toward a more complete understanding. History is always in the present tense,